Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. It began with a question that clawed at the edges of my mind. What if everything I know isn't real? The silence in my small, dimly lit apartment was unnerving. A soundless void where even the air seemed to hold its breath. It was a Monday, or maybe a Tuesday. I had lost track of time. Time seemed to pass differently now, stretched and warped like an elastic band about to snap. I sat at my desk, staring at the book. An old, leather-bound thing I had found in the corner of a second-hand store. It was heavy, with a worn-out cover that looked like it had been through more than a few decades. The pages were yellowed and delicate, fragile as if one wrong move would tear them apart. I didn't know why I bought it. I had no interest in books like that, old diaries or journals. But something about it called to me. The book lay open in front of me, and as I skimmed through the pages, something stopped me cold. My name, written in ink that wasn't mine. It was strange. How could someone else have written about me? I read the words again, slower this time. He stood at the edge of the cliff, staring into the abyss below, knowing that he had no choice but to jump. I blinked. That was a scene from my life. I had stood at the edge of a cliff last summer, facing the void beneath me, my heart racing, my mind torn between fear and the bizarre comfort of jumping. But how could someone else know that? I closed the book quickly, my pulse quickening. There was no way. No way this could be real. But the next few words on the page, right where I had left off, pulled me in again. I couldn't stop. I had to keep reading. The ground beneath his feet trembled slightly. Something was watching him. Something that wasn't supposed to be there. I shivered. I hadn't told anyone about that moment. The feeling that something was watching me as I stood at the cliffside, a sensation I could never shake. I had convinced myself it was just my imagination, but now, no, it was impossible. Someone was writing about things I hadn't shared, details that no one knew. I looked around my apartment, trying to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. It was a typical place, crammed with old furniture, bookshelves filled with novels, a half-eaten sandwich from yesterday on the kitchen counter. Nothing unusual. Nothing at all, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The hum of the refrigerator in the corner suddenly seemed louder than usual, like it was too close. Too intrusive. A tap. A tiny, almost inaudible tap from the other side of the room. I held my breath, straining to hear. Tap. 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 I froze. There it was again. It couldn't be the wind. There were no windows open. I turned slowly, my eyes darting around the room, searching for the source of the noise. My heart thudded in my chest, louder than I could bear. Then it stopped. I stared at the wall, waiting for something. Anything. The sound of my own breathing felt loud in the thick silence. Tap. 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 I blinked. The noise wasn't coming from the wall. It was coming from the book. I quickly slammed the book shut, as if I could trap whatever had escaped. The sudden stillness left me breathless. I glanced at the page where I had been reading. It was blank, but I knew it hadn't been blank before. I had just seen those words. My name, the cliff, that eerie feeling of being watched. And now it was gone. I stood up quickly, my legs shaking. The air around me felt different, thinner somehow. The room was closing in, shifting as if it were no longer the place I had known. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed deeper, more sinister. I reached for the door, desperate to escape, but as my hand touched the knob, the lights flickered. Once. Twice. Then everything went dark. In the pitch black, I heard a voice. Low. Almost a whisper, but undeniably real. You're not alone. I gasped, my heart racing in my chest. The voice wasn't mine. It wasn't anyone I knew. And then, I heard something else. Something that made my skin crawl. A sound. A soft rustling. Like pages turning. I couldn't see anything. Couldn't move. The rustling grew louder. Closer. And then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of writing. Someone was writing. Somewhere in the dark. He couldn't escape. The story was already written. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in the dark, but the silence that followed the voice was suffocating. My fingers trembled against the doorknob as I tried to convince myself that it was all just my mind playing tricks. But the voice, soft and clear, as if it were right beside me, refused to leave. You're not alone. The words echoed in my ears, and I couldn't get rid of them. Every corner of the room seemed to press in, like the walls were moving closer. The darkness wasn't the familiar kind. It was dense, oppressive, alive. I turned toward the desk, barely able to make out the outline of the book, now closed and resting innocently, as if it had never caused any disturbance. My breath came in short bursts. There had to be an explanation. There always was, right? But then why didn't I feel like I could breathe? Why did my hands feel so clammy? I turned the doorknob. The door opened into the hallway, and the harsh light from the bulb above flickered briefly before it stayed on. A sharp contrast to the darkness inside the room. The hallway was empty. Still. Everything was just as it had been before. I stepped out slowly, my feet making a soft scuffing noise on the old wooden floor. The air in the hallway was cold, a chill that seemed out of place, considering the warmth in my apartment just moments ago. I paused, listening. The soft rustling from inside the apartment was gone, but the hair on the back of my neck stood up. Something had changed. The sounds from the book, the voice, it was all part of something bigger. Something I didn't want to face. As I walked further down the hallway, my mind replayed the words from the book. He couldn't escape. The story was already written. They weren't my thoughts. They weren't even my words. They felt like a sentence, like I was already trapped, stuck in someone else's narrative. I had to get out. I needed to leave. But that book, it kept pulling me back. I turned back toward the apartment door, but then I froze. A faint sound, faint but distinct, came from behind me. A scratch. No, not a scratch, a soft thud. Something moving in the shadows. I turned, my heart pounding. The hallway stretched out before me like a tunnel, the end obscured in shadow. And then, just as I was about to retreat back into the apartment, I saw it. At the far end of the hallway, a figure stood in the dim light, just barely visible. Tall. Thin. The shape of a person, but wrong. It was like it didn't belong there, a distortion in the shadows. I could barely make out the outline of its face, but the feeling it gave off was enough to make my stomach churn. It didn't move. It didn't need to. It was just there, watching. I couldn't see its eyes, but I could feel them, staring right at me, boring into my soul. I wanted to scream, but my throat was tight, my voice trapped behind a wall of fear. My legs wouldn't move. I was paralyzed. And then, before I could react, the figure began to step toward me, slowly, like it was savoring every inch it gained. The air around me thickened, grew colder, and the sound of its footsteps was the only thing I could hear. Tap, tap, tap. I wanted to run, but my body wouldn't listen. The figure's movements were unnervingly smooth, like it was made of something that wasn't quite flesh. It didn't look like a person at all. The outline was wrong, too fluid, too stretched. It was like a shadow given form. Tap, tap, tap. I was trapped in the hallway. There was nowhere to go. The door was behind me, but it felt miles away. The figure was closer now, its shape becoming clearer, but still just a blur of darkness. It hadn't made a sound, no footsteps, no breath. But I could feel it, pressing against the air, like it was bending the very space around it. My pulse hammered in my ears. I couldn't breathe. Then, out of nowhere, I remembered the book. I turned, frantically, and ran back into the apartment. My hand scrambled to open the door, my mind a frenzy of panic, but the knob wouldn't turn. It was stuck. I yanked harder, my breath ragged. The door slammed open just as the figure appeared in the doorway. It was standing there, right in front of me. Too close. Its shadow stretched across the room, crawling toward me like a living thing. I could hear it now, its breath. Short, uneven. It was almost familiar. I stumbled backward, my feet tripping over the edge of the rug, but I couldn't look away. I couldn't stop myself from staring into the darkness that had taken shape. It wasn't human, but it felt like me, like something deep inside me, something I had forgotten. And then it moved. The figure reached for me, its hand long and thin, its fingers twitching like they were ready to grab me. I closed my eyes and forced myself to take a deep breath. I had to wake up. This had to be a nightmare. But it wasn't. I could feel the coldness of its touch before it even made contact. I screamed, and everything went black. When I woke up, the room was exactly as it had been before, the same disorienting quiet, the same dim light creeping through the curtains. But I wasn't alone anymore. The book was gone. I woke up with a start, the cold sweat sticking to my skin. My heart was pounding in my chest, and for a moment, I couldn't remember where I was. The room was dark, save for the pale light filtering through the curtains. I blinked, trying to shake off the disorientation, but the feeling of dread wouldn't leave me. It clung to me like a second skin. I sat up slowly, my eyes scanning the room. The apartment looked normal. Too normal. The familiar clutter, books scattered across the desk, the half-eaten sandwich on the counter, none of it had changed. But everything felt wrong. Where was the book? I reached over to the desk, my hand trembling as I searched for it. It wasn't there. I moved faster now, my fingers brushing over the surface, looking for any sign of it. The book had been right there, on the desk, just hours ago, or was it days? Time felt like it was slipping through my fingers, like it was no longer something I could rely on. I stood up, my legs unsteady, and glanced around the apartment, my breath shallow. I had to find it. The book wasn't just a book. It was a door. A door that led to something I couldn't understand, something I didn't want to understand. I went to the living room, then to the kitchen. My eyes darted across the space, but there was no sign of it. I tried to tell myself that it was just a dream. Maybe I had imagined the whole thing, the figure in the hallway, the dark presence in the room, the whispering voice. Maybe it was just stress, exhaustion. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. Then, just as I was about to turn back, something caught my eye. The bookshelf. It was out of place, like it had shifted slightly. I hadn't noticed it before, but now it stood out, like a looming presence in the corner of the room. My feet carried me over to it before I could think, my hand reaching out to pull a random book from the shelf. And then, there it was. The book. It was resting between two other books, half hidden, as if it had never moved. I almost didn't want to touch it, but something drew me in. I pulled it out slowly, feeling the weight of it in my hands, the worn leather cover cool under my fingers. The pages were slightly creased, like they had been turned too many times. I opened it, and the same sensation of cold dread washed over me. The words on the first page were different this time. It wasn't my name, not at first. There was a sound in the distance. Something faint. It was coming closer. I felt a chill run down my spine. It was exactly like before, the same feeling of unease, the same rising tension. The words weren't just written, they were alive. They knew me. And now, they were reaching out to me. I turned the page, my eyes scanning the words. He could feel it now. The presence was inside the room. It had always been there, watching, waiting. But he couldn't see it. Not yet. I felt my breath catch in my throat. The words were describing what was happening, describing me. I couldn't ignore it. The book knew things I hadn't even realized yet. I slammed the book shut, my hands shaking. I couldn't do this. I couldn't let it control me, couldn't let it lead me down this path. But as I stood there, holding the book in my hands, I felt it again. That pull. That inevitable force that made me feel like I had no choice but to read on. A noise. It was faint at first, like the rustling of leaves outside. I couldn't be sure. But then it grew louder. The tapping. The unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate steps echoing from somewhere in the apartment. They weren't mine. They were too heavy, too measured. I turned, but there was no one there. The sound kept getting closer. Tap, tap, tap. I looked toward the door. The hallway outside was empty. But the sound wasn't coming from the hallway. It was coming from inside the room. It was coming from behind me. I slowly turned, my legs stiff with fear. My breath hitched in my chest. And there it was. The figure. Again. It was standing in the doorway, just like before, its form a blur in the dim light. I couldn't see its face, but I felt its presence. The air around me seemed to bend, like the space itself was being warped by its very existence. It didn't make a sound. It didn't move. It just watched. I couldn't breathe. I wanted to scream, but the words caught in my throat. The figure stepped forward, its movements slow, deliberate. I could hear the rustling of fabric, but it wasn't right. The sound was wrong. It was too smooth, too fluid, like it wasn't made of flesh at all. Tap, tap, tap. The footsteps continued, each step sending a shock of cold fear straight through me. I tried to move, to escape, but my feet were glued to the floor. The figure was getting closer. It didn't hurry. It didn't need to. It was inevitable. Then, without warning, it reached out. The hand was long, impossibly thin, the fingers stretching as they hovered just inches from my face. I couldn't look away. The fingers twitched, the skin too pale, too stretched. It was wrong. Everything about it was wrong. And then it spoke. You can't escape the story. You're already here. The words were like ice, cold and sharp. I didn't understand what it meant, but I felt it. I felt the truth of it deep in my bones. I stumbled backward, my hands trying to push against the air as if I could escape it. But the figure didn't stop. It kept coming, closer and closer, its face finally coming into focus. But I still couldn't see it, not clearly. It was a blur, a shape, a distortion. And then, the room went silent. Dead silent. The footsteps stopped. The figure stopped. It was right in front of me now. And I realized something was different. Something had changed. The book was gone again. I glanced down at my hands. They were empty. But then, I heard it. The faintest sound. The rustling of pages. And in that moment, I knew. The book hadn't just disappeared. It had written itself into existence. Again. And this time, I wasn't in control. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the empty space where the book had once been. My hands still felt cold, the weight of its absence pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. The figure, the thing that wasn't human, wasn't anything I could understand, was still in the room, watching me. Its presence was suffocating, its form barely visible in the dim light, but somehow, I could feel it like it was all around me. You can't escape the story. The words echoed in my head, louder now, like a mantra. I could hear them in my bones, in my teeth. It felt like they were becoming a part of me, slipping into my thoughts, my very soul. The figure didn't move, didn't even seem to breathe. It was just there, an impossible distortion of reality. I took a step back, then another. My legs shook with fear, but I couldn't look away. The figure's shape seemed to shift, like it was becoming more solid, more real, with every passing second. It was like the room itself was bending around it, warping in ways I couldn't explain. I had to get out. I had to. Suddenly, the figure's hand shot out, faster than I could react. It wasn't a fluid motion, it was jerky, unnatural, like the thing wasn't used to moving this way. Its fingers reached for me, but this time I saw them clearly, too thin, too long, with nails that curved like claws. I gasped, stumbling backward, but there was nowhere to go. The walls seemed to close in, pushing me toward it, toward whatever this thing was. My mind screamed at me to run, to do anything, but my body refused to obey. My feet were glued to the floor. I could hear the breathing now. It was low, almost imperceptible, but it was there, coming from the figure. It was waiting, watching, just like the book. Like it had been written to be here, to be a part of this moment. You are part of the story now. The words made my skin crawl. It wasn't just speaking to me. It was commanding me, like I had no choice but to follow whatever it wanted. Like it was pulling the strings and I was nothing more than a puppet. My mind raced. The book. The story. Was it real? Was I really inside it? I tried to rationalize it, to push the fear aside. But everything about this felt real. The figure. The silence. The oppressive air. The book had drawn me into something far beyond my understanding, and I was trapped in it. I tried to scream, but the sound caught in my throat. My breath came in ragged gasps as I backed away from the figure, my legs trembling beneath me. It didn't move. It didn't need to. It was already in my mind. I forced myself to focus, my eyes darting around the room, desperate for an escape. But there was nothing. The windows were shut tight, the door locked, and the figure was closing the gap between us with every second. It was inevitable. There was no escape. And then something changed. The air shifted, the temperature dropping suddenly, the room growing colder. A low hum filled the space, vibrating through my bones. I glanced down at my feet, and for the first time, I noticed something strange. The floor was warping beneath me. The wooden planks were bending, twisting, like they were being sucked into the earth itself. I stumbled back in shock, but the ground kept shifting, like the room itself was unraveling. The walls seemed to melt, their edges blurring into nothingness, as if they were made of smoke. I looked up at the figure, but it was gone. It wasn't standing in front of me anymore. I couldn't hear its breathing. For a moment, I thought I had imagined it. Maybe it was just a trick of my mind, my paranoia, but the feeling of its presence still lingered in the air, suffocating me. The floor beneath me groaned, and I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to run. My legs moved before I could think, my body jerking toward the door. But as I reached for the handle, the room shifted again. The door was gone. The walls had closed in, leaving me trapped in an endless void. I spun around, my heart racing in my chest. The book. I had to find the book. It was the only thing that had made sense. The only thing that had held the answers. I fell to my knees, my fingers clawing at the floor, desperately searching for something, anything. And then, as if it had always been there, the book appeared in front of me. It was open, the pages blank. I stared at it, my breath shallow, my mind racing. You can't escape the story. The words were written there, on the page. But they weren't just written, they were alive. They were changing. The ink was still moving, flowing across the page, forming new sentences, new instructions. I tried to read them, but the words blurred, twisting into something I couldn't understand. And then, the writing stopped. The page was empty again. But this time, the feeling was different. The weight of it, the pressure of knowing that I was part of something far beyond my control, was unbearable. I couldn't escape. I was trapped. I reached for the book, my hand shaking, but before I could touch it, the room around me shattered. The walls splintered, the floor cracked, and the darkness swallowed me whole. I fell. I fell for what felt like an eternity, my body weightless, my mind spinning. I couldn't see anything, just blackness, an endless void, but I could feel it. I could feel the presence, watching me from somewhere in the dark. And then, with a sudden jolt, I hit the ground. Hard. The room was different now. The air was heavy with silence. I opened my eyes, blinking, trying to adjust to the dim light. It was the same room, same apartment, same desk. But there was something new, something wrong. The book was on the desk, open, and this time the writing was different. It was about me. I couldn't move. The book was there, right in front of me, as if it had always been there. Open, waiting. The pages were no longer blank. They were filled with words. Words that had been written for me, by someone else, but somehow, for me. I could barely breathe as I leaned over the desk, the weight of the book drawing me in despite every instinct telling me to run, to get away. But I couldn't. My hands trembled, like they had a mind of their own, reaching out to turn the pages. The man stood frozen, unable to comprehend what was happening. The room around him felt like it was closing in, suffocating him with each passing moment. The book was open, its pages filled with his story, and he knew that he had no control over it anymore. I gasped, my hands shaking so violently I almost dropped the book. The words were describing me, again. The man, the protagonist, was me, caught in a story that wasn't my own, one that was being written as I lived it. The room felt smaller now, suffocating. I looked around, my heart pounding in my chest. The walls were too close, the air too thick. It wasn't right. I needed to get out. But as I pushed the book away from me, I realized the room had changed. The walls weren't the same anymore. The angles had shifted. The furniture, too, was different, more worn, older. The familiar had turned unfamiliar. The apartment wasn't my apartment anymore. It was something else. The man looked up, but nothing was familiar anymore. The room he once knew had changed, warped. It was no longer his home, but a place that seemed to exist only in the pages of the book. My eyes snapped back to the page. I hadn't turned it, but the words had already appeared on their own. The story was moving, unfolding without my input, without my consent. The room wasn't just changing, it was rewriting itself, as though it were part of the narrative. I felt a cold chill sweep through me, and I suddenly realized that I wasn't alone. The figure, the presence that had been following me, was in the room again. I could feel it, a pressure in the air that made it hard to breathe. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it. Watching. The man could feel the presence. It was there, close, just out of sight. And though he couldn't see it, he could feel it moving closer, creeping through the very fabric of the space. The words, they were alive again. I could almost hear them, whispering in my head. The sound of the figure's steps, just out of my line of sight, echoed faintly, as though the thing was moving closer, but never quite there. I spun around, my eyes darting across the room. Nothing. The silence was unbearable, like the world had gone still, holding its breath. The light from the window was muted, casting long shadows that twisted unnaturally, stretching like fingers across the floor. The air felt thick, oppressive, and I couldn't tell if the pressure was from the figure or from the weight of the words, the story, closing in on me. The book sat there on the desk, mocking me. The words hadn't stopped. They kept writing, without my input, without my will. I had to stop it. I had to do something before it consumed me completely. My fingers curled into fists, the urge to tear the book apart almost overwhelming. But I knew that if I did, it wouldn't end. It would just rewrite itself. The story would find a new way to keep going, a new way to pull me back in. The figure was proof of that, proof that I couldn't escape. I staggered backward, my legs weak, and bumped into the bookshelf. The force knocked a couple of books to the floor, the sound a sharp crack in the silence. I jumped, my heart hammering in my chest. The figure was closer now. I could feel it, its presence pressing in on me from every side. The man stumbled back, his heart racing as the room seemed to close in around him. He could feel the air grow colder, the pressure of something unseen pushing in on him. And he knew, deep in his bones, that there was no escape. I couldn't take it anymore. The darkness, the cold, the words that kept appearing, the story that never let me go. I had to leave. I had to do something. I grabbed the book from the desk, almost throwing it across the room in my desperation to stop it, to stop the madness. But as my hands touched it, I felt it again, the coldness, the weight of the story wrapping around me like a noose. The man closed the book, but it was too late. The story had already begun, and he was a part of it now. There was no turning back. I didn't even have the strength to fight the words anymore. The story was controlling me, and I was powerless to stop it. I heard a low hum now, coming from somewhere behind me, vibrating through the floorboards. It was the same sound I'd heard before. The same feeling. The same force that twisted reality around me, bending it to its will. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. The air felt thick in my lungs, and the room seemed to press in tighter with every breath. I turned, looking frantically for an escape, but the walls were too close now, the shadows too deep. The figure appeared before me, its shape now clearer than ever. The outline of a man, tall, thin, its face obscured by a shadow that seemed to cling to it like a cloak. The figure stepped forward, its presence growing stronger, filling the room with a weight that pressed down on him like the end of all things. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. It was as if the words had taken control of me, as if the story had already decided how it would end, and I was nothing but a puppet. The figure took another step. Its hand reached out, its fingers elongated, twisted. I could feel it. Feel the coldness emanating from it, the darkness that followed in its wake. It was reaching for me, for my soul, for the very core of my being. And as it touched me, everything went black. Have you ever stared at your reflection for too long, only to feel like it's staring back at you? What if that reflection started doing things you didn't? I had always been drawn to water. The way it mirrored everything, capturing the world in perfect stillness. It had a calming effect on me, a place where thoughts could settle. Or so I thought. I was standing at the edge of a small, quiet lake. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the surface. The water rippled gently, disturbed by the occasional breeze. It was peaceful, at least it was supposed to be. I looked into the water, the familiar image of myself gazing back at me. But something felt off. At first, it was subtle, a slight flicker of movement in the corner of my vision. But as I stared longer, I realized my reflection was changing. The reflection of my face shifted, contorting into something strange. My expression wasn't mine anymore. My lips twitched unnaturally, pulling into a smile that didn't belong. My eyes widened, but the reflection's pupils were too dilated, too dark. I blinked, disoriented. It was just the light, I told myself. Just the way the sun hit the water. But the longer I stared, the clearer it became. My reflection was moving differently than I was. It was alive in a way I wasn't. I stepped back from the water, my heart beginning to pound. The image of myself in the lake lingered, unsettling. I turned away, forcing myself to walk. But something wasn't right. I felt a pull, an urge to look back. And I did. The reflection didn't change when I looked. But as I stood there, frozen in place, it began to do something else. Slowly, it lifted its hand, my hand, and pressed it to the water. It was a mirror image, yet it felt wrong. I had never made that movement. Not like that. Not with that expression. I took a step forward, then another, moving closer to the edge of the lake. The surface was still now, too still. Too perfect. I felt my breath quicken, my throat tightening. Something was wrong, something was creeping in from the edges of my perception. It's just your mind playing tricks, I muttered under my breath, trying to convince myself. Just tired. You're imagining things. But I knew it wasn't true. I took a few more steps closer to the water, unwilling to break the gaze between me and my reflection. The tension was unbearable. Each movement my reflection made seemed more deliberate, more in control, as though it knew something I didn't. The smile that had once been so unnatural now curled in a way that felt wrong. It stretched farther than my face could go, the skin around the edges pulling in impossible ways. The reflection was laughing, silently, and I realized that I wasn't the one in control. I stumbled back, my pulse racing, the world feeling hazy around me. My own reflection, my own face, was mocking me, showing me a version of myself that I didn't recognize. It was becoming more of me than I could handle. More than just a mirror. I spun around to leave, my legs unsteady, but the sound of my reflection's laughter filled the air. It was faint at first, barely perceptible. But as I turned, it grew louder, closer, until I could hear it behind me. The water rippled once again, but not from the wind. No, this time it was something else. Something moving beneath the surface. Something alive. I froze, every instinct telling me to run, to get away. But my legs wouldn't move. I heard a voice. It wasn't mine, but it was close enough that it made me shiver. It was speaking my name. You can't escape, the voice whispered, too quiet to be real, but loud enough that it felt like it was in my head. I whipped around, but there was nothing. Nothing but the darkening water, still and unchanging. The voice seemed to come from the lake itself. You can't escape me, it repeated, this time clearer. The words echoed in my ears, making my stomach twist. It was coming from the reflection. I tried to force my legs to move, to break free from the pull that had me rooted in place. But it felt like the ground itself was holding me down. The reflection in the water began to shift again, this time in a way I couldn't understand. It wasn't just mimicking me anymore. It was becoming something else. It smiled again, that same twisted, grotesque smile. But this time, the smile was not just on the reflection. It was on me too. I could feel my own lips twitching, unwillingly pulling into the same grin. You're not in control, the voice murmured, now a growl. You never were. My breath hitched. Panic surged through me as I realized the reflection wasn't just imitating me, it was controlling me. Pulling me deeper into this madness, into this twisted game. And I was helpless to stop it. The water began to churn again, violently now, as if something below the surface was rising. I couldn't take my eyes off my reflection, which was no longer my own. It was something darker, something alive. And then, in the quietest of whispers, I heard it again. You can't escape. The world around me dissolved into shadows, and I found myself drowning in my own reflection. I couldn't breathe. The air felt thick, suffocating, as if the world around me had shifted into something I couldn't understand. My heart raced, beating so fast I thought it might burst. The reflection, the twisted version of myself, was still there, its smile widening, stretching farther than what should have been possible. I felt my knees buckling, and before I knew it, I was sinking to the ground, my palms pressing into the dirt as the weight of panic pushed me down. "You're still here," the voice echoed, not just from the water, but from every direction, surrounding me. It was everywhere. The world around me seemed to blur. The water, the trees, the very ground I was standing on, everything seemed to pulse in rhythm with my panicked heartbeat. I could feel something in the air, something oppressive, like it was closing in on me, making it harder to breathe. I forced myself to stand, my hands trembling as I wiped the sweat from my forehead. The cold air bit at my skin, but it didn't matter. I wasn't cold. I was terrified. What was happening? I looked down at the water again, half afraid to see what would greet me there. But I had to. I couldn't leave, not yet. There was something pulling me back, something drawing me to the edge. And there it was, my reflection, no longer just mimicking my every move. This time, it wasn't just a reflection. It felt real as I was. It stepped closer to the surface of the water, the reflection's hand now on the water's edge, as if reaching out to me. I staggered backward, my breath coming in short gasps. I couldn't tear my eyes away. It moved with perfect precision, but the way it moved, it was too fluid, too perfect. I felt something in my gut twist. I wasn't in control anymore. The voice came again, softer this time, but still so clear. "You're not who you think you are." My body froze. My mind screamed, trying to rationalize it, but the words had already sunk in. Was I losing my mind? Was this a nightmare? It had to be. It couldn't be real. I shook my head violently. "No," I whispered to myself, my voice shaking. "This isn't real." But the reflection didn't stop. It tilted its head, that grotesque smile still plastered on its face. And then, without warning, it stepped out of the water. The moment it crossed the surface, everything around me seemed to shudder, like the air itself was rippling in response. I couldn't move. My legs were locked in place as the figure, my reflection, stepped closer, its eyes never leaving mine. It was exactly like me, yet nothing like me at all. I opened my mouth to speak, to say something, anything, to make sense of this madness, but no words came out. My throat was dry, my tongue stuck to the roof of my mouth. "Are you afraid?" the reflection asked, its voice now a low, mocking whisper. I could hear it, but the words seemed to come from inside my head. It wasn't just talking to me. It was speaking through me. My heart raced, and I backed away, only to feel the cold touch of the water at my feet. The ground was soft, squishy, and I realized I was stepping closer to the edge, almost as if something was pulling me forward. The reflection moved again, its footstep making no sound on the wet ground. It mirrored my movements exactly, but this time I could feel the change. It wasn't just reflecting me anymore. It was in me, mimicking not just my body, but my thoughts, my deepest fears. "What do you see when you look at me?" it asked, the smile twisting, the voice low and filled with something dark. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, to tear myself away from this nightmare, but it was as if the air itself was thickening around me, binding me in place. I looked down at my reflection's face. Its eyes were wide, almost too wide. And then I saw it, inside the eyes. A flicker of something that wasn't me. Something darker. Something I buried deep inside. You can't hide from me, it whispered. I know everything about you. I wanted to shout, to deny it, but deep down I knew. It wasn't lying. Every part of me, the guilt, the shame, the fears I'd locked away, they were all there, exposed, naked under its gaze. It was reading me, understanding me in a way I didn't want to be understood. Stop it, I muttered, almost pleading. But the reflection only grinned wider, its smile stretching beyond what was possible. I couldn't look away. My body was frozen, but my mind was racing. Every thought felt scrambled, every movement slowed down as I tried to piece together what was happening. What was happening? I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone behind me, but there was nothing. Just the lake, the reflection, and me. You can't run from yourself, the reflection said, its voice now almost kind. You can't escape what you are. The words struck me harder than I expected. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. My reflection stepped forward, its hand reaching out, slowly, almost gently. Come with me, it whispered. And for a moment, I considered it. There was something about the reflection, something soothing, like it knew me better than I knew myself. But then I snapped back to reality, my mind screaming at me to move, to get away. I turned and ran, my legs finally moving, my heart pounding in my chest. But the reflection followed, always there, just behind me. Not physically, no. But it was in my head. It was inside me. And no matter how fast I ran, it was always there, smiling. I couldn't escape. I was trapped in my own mind, and the reflection knew it. I couldn't breathe again. The air around me had thickened, wrapping itself around my lungs like a vice. Every inhale felt like I was swallowing shards of glass. My feet were moving on autopilot, pushing me forward through the woods, but it felt like I was running in slow motion, as if the very ground beneath me was pulling me back. I couldn't outrun it. That thing, the reflection, was always there, just behind my thoughts. It never stopped, never gave me a moment's peace. Its voice echoed in my mind, too real, too sharp, like it was speaking directly inside me, inside every thought. I felt its words clawing at the edges of my consciousness. You can't hide from me. My body was shaking, trembling as I pushed forward, limbs unsteady. Every step felt heavier than the last, every breath shallower. The trees seemed to grow taller, the shadows longer, the path winding impossibly further. It was as if the forest itself was warping around me, shifting into something unfamiliar, something darker. I stumbled. My foot caught on a root, and I crashed to the ground, my palms hitting the cold earth with a sickening slap. I lay there for a moment, my head spinning. I couldn't think, couldn't focus. I tried to get up, but the ground felt like it was pulling me in. My muscles screamed at me, but I pushed against it, desperate to escape. But then, just as I pushed myself to my knees, I heard it. A rustling, soft at first, like something brushing against the undergrowth. But then it grew louder. Closer. It was the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate. I looked around, my heart racing, but there was nothing. Nothing except for the dark, stretching shadows of the trees. You can't outrun me. The voice again, inside my head, a whisper that sent chills down my spine. I clutched my head, shaking as if I could rid myself of the sound. but it only grew louder. Closer. I felt it then, the sensation of eyes on me, not just one set, but many. It was as if the forest was alive, watching me. The trees were bending toward me, their limbs twisting, their branches stretching like fingers reaching for me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I couldn't. Suddenly, there was a flash of movement in the corner of my vision. I snapped my head to the side, but there was nothing there. Just the trees, just the endless, shifting shadows. I stood up, my knees weak. My breath came in ragged gasps. I had to move. I had to get away from here. You can't run. It was getting closer. I could feel it, that presence, that thing inside my mind. I was no longer just being hunted, I was being invaded. The reflection wasn't just following me, it was becoming me. Each thought, each breath, each hesitation, it was all part of it now. I turned and ran again, the thumping of my heart in my ears drowning out the sounds of the forest. But it didn't matter how fast I ran. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape. The voice was everywhere now, twisting around me, wrapping itself around my brain. I tried to focus, to make sense of everything, but my mind felt clouded. Everything felt wrong. The air was colder now. Too cold. My breath fogged in front of me, the mist curling around my body like hands trying to pull me back into the dark. I couldn't see. I couldn't see anything beyond the pale fog creeping through the trees. The mist was thickening, swallowing everything, even the path beneath my feet. And then, I saw it again, the reflection. This time, it wasn't in the water. It was in the mist, standing just at the edge of my vision, waiting. Its smile was the same, too wide, too empty, but this time, the reflection's eyes were not just watching me. They were seeing me, pulling apart every thought I had, every fear I tried to bury. I stopped, my feet frozen in place. "Why are you running?" the reflection asked, its voice too calm, too inviting. I turned around slowly, unwillingly, and looked at the twisted, distorted version of myself standing in the fog. The reflection smile twisted into something darker, something more knowing. It didn't need to speak now. The silence between us was enough. It had already won. I felt my knees give way, and I collapsed to the ground, my body unable to fight anymore. The weight of exhaustion, of fear, crushed me. I closed my eyes, trying to block it out, but it didn't help. The reflection was still there, not just in the mist, but in me. It whispered again, but this time it wasn't a question. It was a command. "You belong to me now." And in that moment, I felt it, felt myself slipping away. My thoughts, my fears, my very essence, it was all becoming part of that thing. The reflection wasn't just something I saw. It was inside me. It was taking me, piece by piece. I reached up, my fingers trembling as they brushed against my face. I couldn't feel it, couldn't feel anything. My own skin seemed foreign to me now, like it wasn't mine. "You can't fight it anymore," the voice purred, now inside my own mind. I tried to scream, but the sound caught in my throat. My mind felt like it was splitting in two, the reflection pulling at every part of me, dragging it into the dark. And I realized then, I wasn't just running from it. I was running from myself. But there was no escape. No way out. Not anymore. I woke up with a jolt, my body jerking upright as if something invisible had yanked me from the darkness. My breath was shallow, and the cold that had settled deep into my bones now felt unbearable. My eyes snapped open, but the world around me remained a blur of muted colors. The mist, it was still there, curling around me like a heavy blanket. For a moment, I wasn't sure if I had escaped. Was I still in the woods? Had I truly woken up, or was I caught in a nightmare I couldn't escape? I tried to push myself up, my body unsteady, my hands sinking into the soft, damp earth beneath me. The ground felt different, wrong, somehow. Too soft, too spongy. I looked down, and for a second, I couldn't process what I was seeing. The earth wasn't the usual dirt and roots I had expected. It was wet, but not with rain. It looked like water, but it wasn't clear. It was darker, like oil slicks floating across the surface, pooling around me. I wiped my hand across my face, trying to clear the haze, but my fingers felt cold. No, colder than that. The temperature had dropped even further. I looked around again, and that's when I realized it. The trees were different. They weren't the same as before. I couldn't recall how they had looked when I first entered the woods, but now they stood twisted, their branches clawing toward the sky like blackened fingers. Some had jagged edges, splintered and broken. The leaves, if they could still be called that, were hanging in unnatural, geometric patterns, as if the trees themselves were trying to copy human shapes. The scene before me felt warped, stretched, as if reality itself was bending under the weight of something unseen. And then it hit me. The reflection wasn't just in the mist or in my mind anymore. It was here, in the world around me. It had bled through. Somehow, it had bled into everything. "It's not over," I whispered aloud to myself, even though I wasn't sure if I was talking to myself or to the presence that had taken hold of this place. I forced my legs to move, pushing against the thick, wet ground, each step heavier than the last. It was as if the earth itself didn't want to let me go, to let me leave. The cold seemed to reach deeper with every movement, pulling at my skin, clawing beneath it. I stumbled, almost falling forward, and as I caught myself against the twisted trunk of one of the trees, I saw something, a figure moving in the mist, just beyond my reach. It was there for a split second before vanishing behind the fog, but it was enough. It was watching me. My heart thudded in my chest, and I couldn't breathe. The reflection had always been just behind me, lurking, but now it was here, in the world. And I could feel it. I could feel its eyes on me, its breath on my neck, even though I couldn't see it clearly. It was in the trees, in the fog, and in every footstep I took. I heard something, a soft, almost imperceptible sound at first. Like a footstep, but wrong. The sound was too slow, dragging, as if something was forcing its way through the mist, step by agonizing step. I turned, my body instinctively freezing. But there was nothing visible. The sound stopped, and the silence that followed felt heavier than the fog around me. For a second, I thought I could hear my own heart, the frantic rhythm of it echoing in my ears. "Are you afraid?" The voice, my reflection's voice, came again, but this time it was not a whisper. It was louder, more tangible, as if it had come from the air itself, from the very trees, from the earth beneath my feet. It reverberated in my mind, twisting every thought until they no longer felt like my own. It felt like the entire forest was speaking at once, each branch, each leaf, each shadow, all unified under that single voice. I wanted to scream, but my mouth felt dry. I couldn't even manage a whisper. "You're not real," I whispered hoarsely. I wasn't sure if I was trying to convince myself or if I was daring the reflection to prove me wrong. I am real, it replied, its voice now directly behind me, cold and mocking. And you're mine. Before I could react, the mist thickened. The air grew denser, making it almost impossible to see beyond a few feet in front of me. The ground trembled slightly, like something was moving beneath it, shifting, adjusting, waiting. I turned, searching for any sign of movement, but nothing. But then, just as my senses began to overload, I felt it. A tug. A pull from behind. My body jerked involuntarily, like someone had yanked my very soul, dragging me back into the fog. I stumbled, trying to break free, but the more I struggled, the stronger it became. I looked down, and for a moment, the ground seemed to blur, shift in ways that didn't make sense. The earth beneath me was warping again, bending like it was water, like I was standing on the surface of a pool about to sink beneath it. The trees started to sway, their branches twisting, contorting as though they were trying to reach for me. You can't run anymore. The voice was everywhere now, inside me, around me, and in the very world itself. I couldn't escape it. I couldn't escape myself. And then, with a sickening lurch, I felt the ground give way beneath my feet. I fell, plunging into the dark, into the void. I could feel myself spiraling downward, my body weightless, my mind blank, the reflection laughing in the distance. You belong to me, forever. And for the first time, I wasn't sure if I wanted to fight anymore. I blinked, my vision clouded and unfocused as I slowly regained awareness of my surroundings. My head throbbed painfully, the sensation like someone had wrapped my skull in cold, heavy metal. My body felt disoriented, as if I had just fallen through a deep, crushing weight. Slowly, I pulled myself up, the earth under me soft, like sand, but colder, almost ice-like. The fog had thickened again, so dense that it seemed to swallow every trace of light. I reached out with my hands, feeling the damp air close in around me. For a moment, I couldn't be sure where I was anymore, whether this place even existed in the same way I did. The trees were there, looming dark and twisted, but they seemed less like part of the world and more like hollow shadows. As if they were not really trees, just empty reflections of something I didn't understand. Is this real? The question slipped from my lips before I could stop it. I knew the answer. No, it wasn't real. None of this could be. It was a nightmare, or maybe my own mind had finally cracked. But even as I tried to convince myself, I felt the weight of the words linger, hanging in the air like a heavy fog that refused to dissipate. The silence pressed down on me, suffocating, and then I heard it, a faint rustling sound, too quiet to be the wind. I froze, my pulse quickening. The rustling grew louder, then sharper, as if someone, or something, was moving through the fog behind me. I spun around, my heart racing, but I saw nothing. The mist seemed to hold its breath, curling in upon itself. My throat tightened. The voice had said I belonged to it. But why? What was the reflection, and what did it want from me? The question echoed in my mind, but there was no answer, only the unsettling feeling that something was watching me from within the fog, something with eyes that burned into my soul. It's not over, the voice whispered, and this time it was too close, as if it had crawled under my skin and was speaking directly in my ear. My body tensed, my hand flying to my neck, but there was nothing there. You can't hide from me, the voice crooned, smooth and mocking. You're already a part of me. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But my legs were heavy, as if they were bound to the earth, rooted deep into the ground. The trees around me seemed to bend, their branches stretching unnaturally in my direction, each movement a slow, deliberate stretch toward me, a threat with every inch. I forced myself to move, my legs shaking as I stumbled forward, my breath shallow, quick. Each step was a battle against the crushing weight of the fog, the suffocating pull of the atmosphere that felt like something alive, something sentient. I had to get out. I had to escape. The world shifted again. As I moved deeper into the fog, I noticed something strange, a light, dim and flickering, as if a far-off lantern was struggling to stay alight. It was faint but there. I knew it couldn't be real. It had to be another hallucination, some trick my mind was playing on me. But something about it drew me in. I stumbled toward it, feeling the grip of the fog loosening for a moment, just enough to give me hope. The light flickered again, this time brighter, and I quickened my pace, though my legs were beginning to buckle under me. "You can't outrun me." The voice was closer now, closer than before, like a whisper curling around my very bones. It wasn't just a sound. It felt like it was inside my mind, pushing against my thoughts, warping my very perception. But I kept moving, toward the light. The trees parted slightly as I neared the source, and I found myself at the edge of a clearing. The mist was thinner here, but the air was still thick with dread. The light was coming from an old lantern, hanging from a branch of one of the twisted trees, its glow sickly and pale. The flame was small, almost pitiful, struggling to keep its fire alive. And then I saw it. In the center of the clearing stood a figure, shrouded in the same fog that clung to the ground like a blanket. At first, it was just a silhouette, indistinct, but as I moved closer, my heart sank. It was me, but not in the way I had expected. This reflection, this version of me, was wrong. Twisted. Its face was pale, more gaunt than my own, eyes hollow and wide with something dark and ancient. It was smiling, but the smile was wrong. It wasn't a human smile. It was empty, like a mask, and yet somehow, it was so real that it sent a shudder through my entire body. It raised its hand, and I froze. I couldn't move, couldn't look away. "You were always meant to be here," it said, its voice a perfect mockery of my own. "You can never leave. You never really did." I felt a coldness grip my chest, a freezing sensation that spread like ice through my veins. It was the reflection, but it was more than that. It wasn't just watching me. It was me. A darker version, a twisted echo of myself. The ground beneath me seemed to shift again, warping into something more fluid. The trees began to bend, their branches creaking as if alive, like they were reaching out to ensnare me. "You've been here all along." I gasped for breath, but it was as if the air itself was being squeezed out of me. My reflection, "No," it smiled wider, and I could feel it in the pit of my stomach, the terror, the knowing that I could never escape it. The light flickered one last time before going out completely, plunging me into complete darkness. And then I understood. I wasn't alone. I had never been alone. The reflection had always been there, a part of me, pulling me back, dragging me deeper into the fog. I was trapped. Is it possible for the world to feel colder, even in the midst of winter? That was the first thought that struck me the moment I stepped outside, staring at the flakes falling from the sky. It was supposed to be just a regular snowstorm, like any other. But something felt wrong, something felt off. The snow wasn't white. It wasn't even gray. It was black. small, jagged flakes that seemed to absorb the light around them rather than reflect it. At first, I thought I was seeing things, but when I rubbed my eyes, it was still there, the sky filled with those unnatural particles floating down. I was standing in front of the gas station where I worked, the usual hum of the neon sign flickering above me. The air smelled strange, metallic almost, like burnt wires or something that wasn't meant to be inhaled. The wind was silent, but the snow, it was silent, too. No crunching beneath my boots, no sound of anything landing. It felt wrong. A deep, inexplicable unease settled in my chest. "Hey, Jack, you see this?" My coworker, Carla, stepped out onto the porch, holding a cigarette in her trembling hand. Her face was pale, and her voice shaky, even though she was trying to sound casual. "This can't be real." I turned to her, but her eyes, there was something about them. Not panic. Not even confusion. They were empty. Hollow. Like she was already losing something. Losing herself. I felt a tightness in my throat as I stared at her. "Yeah," I said, trying to push the creeping feeling away. "Yeah, it's weird, right?" I had no idea what to make of it. At first, I thought maybe it was just a freak weather pattern, something unexplainable but natural. But I knew deep down it was more than that. And something else was happening, too. Something I didn't want to admit. The town had been quiet for days now. Too quiet. People were acting strange. I remembered the conversations that had been circulating at work, quiet, almost whispered, about the others, the ones who had started to seem distant. Like they weren't fully there. Some of them had said they'd been feeling off for a while. Others couldn't even describe it. It didn't take long before I noticed it, too. The first sign was subtle. People stopped smiling. Or laughing. And they stopped caring about small things. Like the weather. Or even each other. Emotions, once so natural, had seemed to evaporate into thin air. Just like the snow. Carla took a deep drag from her cigarette and looked at me again, her eyes wide, but still vacant. "It's not just the snow, you know? People around here, they're changing." I swallowed hard. No. This wasn't possible. People couldn't just change like that. But they had. I could see it in their faces, hear it in their voices, flat, disconnected, hollow. Like something had been stolen from them, something vital. "Did you feel it?" I jumped, not expecting the voice. Carla hadn't spoken. My mind began to race as I turned toward the source of the voice. But there was nothing. Nothing but the dark snow swirling around, blanketing everything in sight. I was starting to question my own sanity. Could I even trust what I was seeing anymore? I shook my head and turned back to Carla. "We need to warn people. We can't just let this go on." But she didn't respond. She stood there, staring at the sky, her cigarette burning low in her hand. She seemed empty. Like I wasn't even there anymore. I felt a coldness seep through me, deeper than the chill of the snow. My feet were frozen, and I couldn't move, as though something invisible had me in its grasp. A whisper grazed my ear, just out of reach, but loud enough to send a shiver through my spine. "It's not just the snow." I snapped back to reality, my pulse pounding in my ears. The flakes, dark as tar, fell harder now, almost like they were being forced down by something beyond the atmosphere. But no one seemed to care. No one noticed anything was wrong. In the distance, I could hear the faint sound of a car starting, but it wasn't like any car I'd ever heard. It sounded muffled, distorted, as though the air itself was warping around the noise. That same oppressive silence, unsettling and unnatural, hung in the air. I needed to find out what was going on. If the town was changing, if people were losing themselves, then I had to act before it was too late. I turned away from the gas station, looking back toward the town center. The streetlights flickered above me, casting long shadows on the snow-covered pavement. But there was no one on the streets. The streets themselves seemed eerily empty, despite the fact that people had to be somewhere. I started walking, my footsteps muffled under the weight of the strange black snow. It didn't take long before I found the first of many signs. At the corner of Pine Street, the town's oldest church loomed. The door, always locked and stiff, was wide open. I stepped inside, the door creaking loudly behind me. The air inside smelled like damp wood and something else. A lingering, acrid scent. The pews were empty. The candles, which had always burned steadily, were now extinguished, and the faintest flicker of a cold, dark light seemed to pulse from the altar. And then, in the back, I saw it. A figure, standing still. Its back turned to me. "Welcome." The voice was smooth. Cold. Not human. I stepped back. But it wasn't the figure I was afraid of. No. It was the feeling. The way the room had shifted, like it had become something else entirely. A place where nothing made sense, and everything was wrong. I turned, my heart racing, and ran back outside, the door slamming shut behind me. This isn't happening, I thought, gasping for breath. It can't be happening. But the snow didn't stop. And neither did the creeping dread inside me. I couldn't shake the image of the figure from the church. It stayed with me, clinging to my thoughts like the heavy black snow still falling from the sky. The town, or what was left of it, felt even more suffocating now. I walked down the quiet streets, avoiding the icy sidewalks where the snow was thickest. The world around me was shrouded in a dark veil. Nothing was normal anymore. The usual hum of the streetlights was gone, replaced by a heavy, unnatural silence that pressed against my ears, making my head feel like it was full of cotton. I passed the grocery store, but the lights inside flickered in a strange rhythm, as if they were trying to send a message, but couldn't quite get it right. I peeked inside the windows. The shelves were full of food, but no one was there. Not a single person. The town had become a ghost town, and I was the only one left who seemed to notice. Or at least, the only one still feeling. I turned the corner toward the park, a place I used to visit as a kid when things were simpler. But now, even the park felt wrong. The trees were bare, but the way the black snow clung to their branches made them look like twisted skeletons, reaching out to grasp at anything within reach. As I walked, I noticed that there was no crunching under my boots. No satisfying sound of snow giving way to my weight. The snow was soft. Too soft. It felt like I was walking on something alive. My feet sank into it too easily, and the further I walked, the more I felt like I was sinking into something deeper than just the ground. Something was pulling me down. I stopped. The air felt heavier here, and I couldn't figure out if it was the snow or something else. I glanced over my shoulder. No one was following me. The streets were empty, as they had been all day, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I took a deep breath and forced myself to keep walking, but my mind was already racing. What had happened to everyone? Carla, The people in the store, were they still in there, hiding somewhere, or had they vanished? Had the black snow already gotten to them? The further I walked, the more the sensation of being watched crept up on me, tightening like a vice around my chest. My heart thudded harder with every step, the pressure in my ears building. And then, from behind me, I heard something. A whisper. It was too soft at first to make out. But then it grew louder, more distinct. Come closer. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. I wasn't imagining this. The voice, it was real. I spun around, expecting to see someone standing there, someone to explain this madness, but all I saw was the snow falling in eerie silence, the dark flakes swirling in the wind, their shadows twisting unnaturally on the ground. Then, the whisper came again, clearer this time, as though it were right beside my ear. You can't run from it. I staggered back, stumbling over a patch of ice. My pulse hammered in my chest. It was as though the voice was coming from everywhere, all at once, from the air, from the trees, from the ground beneath my feet. I had to get out of here. I turned and started walking faster, the whisper following me, growing louder with each step. There was no escape. It knew where I was. It knew everything. My legs felt heavier, the weight of the snow increasing, making it harder to move. And then, the ground beneath me shifted, like something was moving underneath. I tried to run, but it was no use. My body felt like it was trapped in molasses, the air thick and oppressive, the snow dragging at me like an invisible hand. Panic set in. My vision blurred as I gasped for air, my chest tightening. And then, I saw it. Out of the corner of my eye, in the distance, I saw the figure from the church standing at the far end of the park. The same figure, its back to me. The same dark silhouette that had haunted my every thought. No. No, no, no. I tried to scream, but the sound got caught in my throat, a strangled gasp instead of a cry. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The figure turned slowly, its face obscured by the hood of a tattered cloak. But when it lifted its head, I saw something I could never unsee. Its face wasn't human. The skin was cracked, black veins coursing across its skin like a web of dark fire. Its eyes were empty pits, no light, no emotion, just darkness. A void, pulling me in. You've been chosen, it whispered in a voice that wasn't quite human. The words echoed in my mind, not just in my ears. And then, without warning, it started moving toward me, its long, jerky steps dragging across the snow. The ground beneath it seemed to bend and shift, as though it was following something deep within the earth. I turned and ran, the whisper still echoing in my mind. You can't run from it. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. My feet were barely touching the ground as I ran, my legs moving on their own, but the snow seemed to resist me at every step, pulling me back, trying to swallow me whole. The air was thick. The darkness was growing, creeping at the edges of my vision. And the figure was still there, just behind me, getting closer. I wasn't going to make it. The cold air stung my skin as I ran, but it wasn't the biting chill that made my bones ache. No, it was the pressure, an invisible weight pushing down on me, a force stronger than any snowstorm I'd ever felt. The black snow swirled around me, thick as ink, coating everything in a suffocating layer. My breath came in ragged gasps, sharp and shallow, each inhale like I was trying to breathe through a sieve. My legs screamed in protest, but I couldn't stop. I had to keep moving. Behind me, the whisper still clung to the air, like an insidious echo. You can't escape. I pushed myself harder, my eyes darting around for any kind of escape. But the park was empty. The trees, those skeletal figures, swayed in a way that was almost unnatural, too slow, too deliberate. The ground beneath my feet was soft, like it was shifting with every step I took. It wasn't just snow. There was something else, something alive, clinging to the earth beneath me. As I ran, I stumbled over something, a wooden plank buried in the snow, and fell, hard, to the ground. The snow felt like it was suffocating me as I lay there, my face pressed against it. But before I could push myself up, I felt a cold hand brush my shoulder. I jerked away, my heart thudding wildly in my chest. There was no one there. Nothing visible. Just the sound of the whisper. "It's coming." Panic surged through me. I scrambled to my feet, my pulse hammering in my ears. I had no idea where I was running anymore, no idea which way led to safety. Everything looked the same. The world had flattened, like the snow had consumed all the color and detail, leaving behind a washed-out, indistinct world. What's happening? I thought back to earlier, when I had seen the figure. Its face, its eyes. I couldn't get the image out of my mind. How could something that didn't even look human be so terrifying? There was no answer. There was no logic anymore, just a growing sense of dread. I glanced behind me. The figure was closer now. It was no longer standing still. It was moving in a strange, jerky fashion, like it was struggling against the air itself. But it was getting closer with every step. The darkness in its eyes, no pupils, no emotion, consumed everything around it, as if it were drawing the very light from the world. I could barely see the edges of the trees anymore. The world around me was dissolving into a haze of black and gray, until there was only the figure and the snow. It was getting closer. Why can't I run faster? The thought was like a broken record, looping endlessly in my head. My legs were heavy, like they were made of stone. Every step felt like a battle. The whisper was growing louder, more insistent, wrapping itself around my thoughts. You can't run forever. I looked ahead, searching for something, anything that might help. That's why I saw it. The church. The same place where I had first seen the figure. It stood in the distance, silhouetted against the thick, swirling snow, its spire piercing the sky like a warning. I knew I had to get there. It felt like the only place that might offer any sort of refuge, but as I turned toward it, I saw something even more unsettling. A group of people stood outside the church, motionless. They were facing me, but their eyes were vacant, their expressions blank. It was as if they didn't see me, just stood there, frozen in place. I knew them. Some of them were people I had seen around town, old Mr. Jenkins, the librarian, and a woman whose name I couldn't recall but whose face was all too familiar. They looked like they were made of the same lifeless, gray snow that covered the ground. The black flakes had settled on their clothes, their skin, but there was no color in their faces. No life. Are they dead? I couldn't stop. I had to get to the church. But as I started to move toward them, something happened. The snow beneath me shifted again, like something massive was moving under the earth, crawling toward me. I looked down. The snow was alive, pulsing with a slow, rhythmic throb. And then, without warning, the ground beneath my feet cracked open. A deep rumble shook the earth, and I felt the world tilt. I fell, and the black snow seemed to pull at me, wrapping around my body, constricting, dragging me into the cold, dark abyss beneath the earth. I fought against it, my hands scraping at the snow as I tried to push myself free, but it was too strong. The more I struggled, the tighter it pulled, until the world above me became a distant blur. The last thing I saw before the darkness consumed me was the figure, standing at the edge of the hole, staring down at me with its hollow eyes. "It's only just beginning," it whispered, its voice vibrating through my bones. Then, everything went black. I don't know how long I was unconscious. Time didn't exist anymore, nothing did. When I woke, it was to the sound of the snow shifting around me. It felt like I was buried alive, suffocating beneath layers of cold, wet earth. My body was frozen, and my limbs refused to obey as I tried to move. But there was something more than just cold pressing against me. Something heavier, like a weight on my chest, keeping me still. I gasped for air, but there was none. The darkness was thick, impenetrable, and I could barely make out my own breath, even though I could feel it in my lungs, sharp and shallow. Then, a voice. "You're not alone." The voice was soft, barely a whisper, but it felt like it was everywhere. Inside my head, around me, pressing in from all directions. I couldn't tell where it was coming from, but it was there, always there, like a presence lingering just beyond my reach. "Who's there?" I croaked, my throat dry, my voice breaking under the strain. No answer. But the pressure on my chest lightened just a fraction. The sensation of being buried alive, suffocating under the weight of something ancient and powerful, was still there, but now it felt almost distant, as if something had lifted just enough to let me breathe. I shifted my arms, forcing them to move. Every inch of my body felt like it was made of stone, stiff and unyielding, but eventually my hand hit something cold, something solid. Slowly, I pushed myself up, my fingers scraping against rough wood, feeling the grain of it beneath my touch. Panic surged again. Where was I? With every ounce of strength I had left, I pushed. The darkness surrounding me didn't make sense. It was suffocating, but it wasn't physical. It was more like the world around me had been erased. I could feel the earth beneath me, but it wasn't the same as the cold snow I had known before. This was something else. Finally, after what felt like hours of struggling, I broke through. The first breath of air was like fire in my lungs. I blinked hard, trying to clear my vision, but the world before me was no clearer. The black snow was still falling, but it was different now. It wasn't just in the air. It was in the very fabric of the world, like the earth itself had become infected. The sky, the trees, the ground, it all seemed coated in that oppressive, thick blackness. And then I saw it. The figure. It was standing at the edge of a crumbling building, its shape darker than the shadows that surrounded it. Its face, or what I thought had been a face, was nothing more than a shifting mass, like a reflection in a broken mirror, warped and fragmented. It had no eyes, no mouth. Just that void where its face should have been, a place where nothing could ever exist. But I could feel it. I could feel it looking at me. I tried to move, but my legs didn't respond. My body was still frozen, trapped by the oppressive cold that seemed to stretch beyond the physical. It was in my mind, pulling at my thoughts. I could hear the whispers again, louder now, filling my head with their maddening insistence. "You can't escape." I shook my head, trying to block out the voice, but it was impossible. The words were like needles, pricking at my thoughts, leaving behind a numbness I couldn't escape. "You can't run." The ground beneath me trembled, and I looked down. The snow was moving again. Not falling, moving. It was crawling, spreading across the ground like a living thing, twisting and writhing as though it had its own will. The more it moved, the darker the world around me became. The black snow was consuming everything, erasing it piece by piece. The figure moved closer. It was slow, but it didn't need to rush. It knew it had all the time in the world. Its presence was overwhelming, suffocating. And as it drew nearer, I could hear the sound of its footsteps, soft but deliberate, crunching through the snow with a terrifying finality. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was trapped. I couldn't move. The very air felt like it was thick with something I couldn't name, and I realized with a sickening certainty that this was no longer just about survival. This was something bigger, something far beyond me, beyond this town, beyond the snow. It's not just the snow, I whispered to myself, though the thought terrified me. This is something else. Something older. Something that wants to end everything. But then I heard another sound. A voice. It wasn't the same voice as before. This one was different. It was distant, yet familiar. A memory. A face I couldn't place. But somehow, I knew it was trying to reach me. Get up, the voice urged. You have to get up. I didn't know who it was, but I tried. With every ounce of strength left in my body, I pushed myself up, my legs finally responding, though they felt like they were made of lead. I was shaking, my body racked with exhaustion and fear, but I couldn't stay here. I couldn't let the darkness consume me. I had to get away. The figure was closer now, its presence unbearable. It reached for me with hands that were not hands, fingers that melted into the air like smoke. I could see the blackness of its form expanding, devouring the world around it. And that's when I knew there was no escape from this. But I would fight. I would find a way, even if it meant tearing apart the very fabric of reality. The ground beneath me split open again, and I stumbled forward into the abyss, my last thought a fractured plea for something, anything, to save me from the cold. I felt the darkness closing in around me as I stumbled forward, my feet slipping on the icy ground. The air had grown heavier, denser, as if the very atmosphere was conspiring to suffocate me. My breath came in shallow gasps, and each step I took felt like I was walking deeper into a dream, no, a nightmare that I couldn't escape. The weight of it pressed against me, like invisible hands clutching at my skin. I couldn't even hear my footsteps anymore. The snow, the black snow, had become a thick, oppressive silence. Everything, every sound, was swallowed whole. It was as though the world had stopped, just paused. I was the only thing moving. The only thing alive. Behind me, the figure, if it could still be called that, was moving closer. I could feel its presence. It was there, even if I couldn't turn around to see it. I could feel it watching me, its non-eyes boring into the back of my head, a constant pressure that seemed to drag at my very soul. I wasn't sure how far I had walked. I had no idea where I was anymore. The familiar landmarks of the town were gone, lost to the snow that had overtaken everything. The buildings, once so solid and real, were now twisted and half collapsed, their outlines barely visible through the shifting, swirling storm. The black snow continued to fall, thickening the air, settling on everything like a blanket of despair. Suddenly, there was a sound. A snap. A crack. I froze. I turned my head, searching desperately for the source. The air shifted, the pressure around me increasing, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Then, there it was. A figure emerged from the darkness, stepping out of the swirling snow as if it had always been there. At first, I thought it was the same shadowy form I had been running from, but it wasn't. This one was different. It was human. Or at least it looked human. A man, tall, gaunt, and draped in layers of ragged clothing, stood in front of me. His face was obscured by the shadows, but I could see his eyes. They were empty, hollowed out, black pits that seemed to stare right through me. I opened my mouth to scream, to warn him, but no sound came. My voice was gone, just like the rest of the world around me. The man took a step forward, and I instinctively took a step back, my body moving on its own. I could feel the cold in my bones, the fear tightening in my chest. I tried to speak again, but nothing. Not a single word escaped my lips. "You can't run from this." The voice, the same voice I had heard before, came again, but now it was clearer, sharper, as if it had been waiting for me to acknowledge it. I could feel my heart racing in my chest, the pounding of it deafening in the silence. The man stepped closer, his movements slow, deliberate. There was something unnatural about the way he moved, like he wasn't quite right, like he wasn't fully in the world anymore. Each step seemed to distort the air around him, bending the space in a way that didn't make sense. "You can't fight it," the voice whispered in my head, and the man's lips didn't move. His eyes remained locked onto mine, his gaze unblinking. I took another step back, my legs trembling, my mind spiraling into panic. But no matter how far I moved, the man followed. There was no escape. There was only the crushing certainty that I was being pulled into something I couldn't understand. It's already too late. I didn't want to believe it. I couldn't. But as I looked around, the evidence was clear. The air, the ground, the world, it was all wrong. The black snow was not just snow. It was a disease, a parasite that had taken root in the very fabric of reality. I could feel it crawling beneath my skin, a coldness that gnawed at my thoughts, my sanity. I turned to run, but the ground beneath me buckled. The earth cracked open, and I fell, plunging into darkness once again. I hit the ground hard, but I barely felt it. The darkness had already swallowed me whole. For a moment, I thought I had died. But then I heard the whisper again. "You can't escape." I opened my eyes. The world was shifting, bending, warping around me. I was back in the same place, or at least it looked like the same place. The buildings loomed overhead, their outlines distorted as if they were melting. The air was thick with the black snow, and the ground beneath me was soft, yielding like wet clay. And then I saw it. The thing. It was not the man. This was something far worse. Its shape was fluid, constantly changing, a nightmare that twisted and writhed like a living thing. It was neither human nor beast, neither solid nor shadow. It was everything. And nothing. I stumbled backward, my legs failing beneath me. I felt sick, like my body couldn't handle the very sight of it. My chest tightened, my breathing shallow, my pulse erratic. The thing, whatever it was, reached out toward me, its limbs stretching, elongating, distorting as it moved. I could feel it pulling me in, dragging me closer with every movement. My body was not my own anymore. I couldn't fight it. I couldn't. The world went black. What if the walls could tell you their secrets? What if the place you thought was empty had been hiding something all along? The idea of exploring abandoned buildings had always fascinated me. There was something about the quiet, the desolation, the eerie sense of forgotten history that drew me in. But this place, this hospital, was different. From the moment I laid eyes on it, I felt something stir in the pit of my stomach. A warning. A feeling that whatever had happened here had never fully left. The hospital stood on the edge of town, isolated from the world around it by a thick line of trees. The building loomed over me like a ghost from the past, its jagged outline barely visible through the creeping fog. The windows were shattered, some boarded up, others completely empty, as though the glass had been sucked out of them. There were no signs of life. No sounds except the wind rustling through the trees. It was as though time had simply stopped in this place. I had heard rumors about it, stories of patients who had vanished without a trace, whispers of strange experiments. But no one had been inside for years, at least not anyone who had come back to talk about it. Curiosity won out, as it always did. I took a step forward, my boots crunching against the gravel path that led up to the hospital's entrance. The door was slightly ajar, and I pushed it open, the hinges creaking loudly in the silence. It felt like the building itself was awake, like it had been waiting for me to step inside. The first thing that hit me was the smell. It wasn't the sterile, clean scent you would expect from a hospital. No, this was something far worse, damp and musty, a mix of decay and something else, something metallic, almost as if the air itself had absorbed years of suffering. My throat tightened, but I ignored it. The further I walked in, the more the smell seemed to cling to me, pressing against my skin. I was in a wide, dimly lit hallway. The floors were cracked, covered with dust and debris. A few abandoned hospital carts lay discarded in the corners. The walls were lined with peeling paint, and the fluorescent lights above flickered intermittently, casting long shadows across the hallway. I could almost hear the faint echo of footsteps, distant but unmistakable. It was probably just my mind playing tricks on me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As I moved deeper into the hospital, the air grew colder. My breath began to mist in front of me, and I pulled my jacket tighter around myself, trying to ignore the rising unease in my chest. The hallway stretched on, and soon I came to a door that was slightly cracked open. It looked like an old office. The kind of place where someone might have sat at a desk, scribbling notes or reviewing charts. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was mostly empty, save for an old desk and a few chairs. The windows, like most in the building, were covered with grime and dirt, allowing only a faint, sickly light to filter through. A stack of papers was scattered across the desk, and I couldn't resist the urge to look through them. I shuffled through the pages, most of them too faded to make sense of, but a few were still legible. A name caught my eye, Dr. Malcolm Roth. The name felt familiar, but I couldn't place where I had heard it before. I turned the paper over, and the words written on the back sent a chill down my spine. The experiments must continue. They are close. Too close. I dropped the paper in a hurry, my heart pounding. The silence in the room felt thicker now, more oppressive. I could hear the faint rustling of something. No, not something. Someone. A sound like footsteps, moving deliberately and slowly. I wasn't alone. I turned toward the doorway, my body freezing in place. The hallway was empty, but something about the shadows seemed to move, to shift. I felt a presence, like eyes watching me from the darkness. My pulse raced, and I knew I had to leave, but my feet wouldn't move. The shadows seemed to stretch toward me, as if they were alive, reaching out with unseen hands. Suddenly, I heard a voice, a whisper. It was faint at first, so quiet I thought I might have imagined it. But then it grew louder. You shouldn't be here. I whipped around, but the room was still empty. The voice had come from inside my own head, but it was too real to ignore. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to focus. This was just my mind playing tricks. The place was abandoned. The stories, the rumors, they were just stories. I could leave. I could walk out of here and forget all of this. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Someone was here with me. And it wasn't about to let me go without showing me what it had been hiding all this time. As I turned to leave, a sharp sound echoed from deeper in the building, a thudding noise followed by a soft dragging sound. My heart skipped a beat. It was getting closer. I had to get out. But something told me that leaving wasn't going to be as simple as I thought. What if the walls could tell you their secrets? What if the place you thought was empty had been hiding something all along? The idea of exploring abandoned buildings had always fascinated me. There was something about the quiet, the desolation, the eerie sense of forgotten history that drew me in. But this place, this hospital, was different. From the moment I laid eyes on it, I felt something stir in the pit of my stomach. A warning. A feeling that whatever had happened here had never fully left. The hospital stood on the edge of town, isolated from the world around it by a thick line of trees. The building loomed over me like a ghost from the past, its jagged outline barely visible through the creeping fog. The windows were shattered, some boarded up, others completely empty, as though the glass had been sucked out of them. There were no signs of life. No sounds except the wind rustling through the trees. It was as though time had simply stopped in this place. I had heard rumors about it, stories of patients who had vanished without a trace, whispers of strange experiments. But no one had been inside for years, at least not anyone who had come back to talk about it. Curiosity won out, as it always did. I took a step forward, my boots crunching against the gravel path that led up to the hospital's entrance. The door was slightly ajar, and I pushed it open, the hinges creaking loudly in the silence. It felt like the building itself was awake, like it had been waiting for me to step inside. The first thing that hit me was the smell. It wasn't the sterile, clean scent you would expect from a hospital. No, this was something far worse, damp and musty, a mix of decay and something else, something metallic, almost as if the air itself had absorbed years of suffering. My throat tightened, but I ignored it. The further I walked in, the more the smell seemed to cling to me, pressing against my skin. I was in a wide, dimly lit hallway. The floors were cracked, covered with dust and debris. A few abandoned hospital carts lay discarded in the corners. The walls were lined with peeling paint, and the fluorescent lights above flickered intermittently, casting long shadows across the hallway. I could almost hear the faint echo of footsteps, distant but unmistakable. It was probably just my mind playing tricks on me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As I moved deeper into the hospital, the air grew colder. My breath began to mist in front of me, and I pulled my jacket tighter around myself, trying to ignore the rising unease in my chest. The hallway stretched on, and soon I came to a door that was slightly cracked open. It looked like an old office. The kind of place where someone might have sat at a desk, scribbling notes or reviewing charts. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was mostly empty, save for an old desk and a few chairs. The windows, like most in the building, were covered with grime and dirt, allowing only a faint, sickly light to filter through. A stack of papers was scattered across the desk, and I couldn't resist the urge to look through them. I shuffled through the pages, most of them too faded to make sense of, but a few were still legible. A name caught my eye, Dr. Malcolm Roth. The name felt familiar, but I couldn't place where I had heard it before. I turned the paper over, and the words written on the back sent a chill down my spine. The experiments must continue. They are close. Too close. I dropped the paper in a hurry, my heart pounding. The silence in the room felt thicker now, more oppressive. I could hear the faint rustling of something. No, not something. Someone. A sound like footsteps, moving deliberately and slowly. I wasn't alone. I turned toward the doorway, my body freezing in place. The hallway was empty, but something about the shadows seemed to move, to shift. I felt a presence, like eyes watching me from the darkness. My pulse raced, and I knew I had to leave, but my feet wouldn't move. The shadows seemed to stretch toward me, as if they were alive, reaching out with unseen hands. Suddenly, I heard a voice, a whisper. It was faint at first, so quiet I thought I might have imagined it. But then it grew louder. You shouldn't be here. I whipped around, but the room was still empty. The voice had come from inside my own head, but it was too real to ignore. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to focus. This was just my mind playing tricks. The place was abandoned. The stories, the rumors, they were just stories. I could leave. I could walk out of here and forget all of this. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Something, someone, was here with me. And it wasn't about to let me go without showing me what it had been hiding all this time. As I turned to leave, a sharp sound echoed from deeper in the building, a thudding noise followed by a soft dragging sound. My heart skipped a beat. It was getting closer. I had to get out. But something told me that leaving wasn't going to be as simple as I thought. I forced myself to move. My legs felt stiff, as if they were made of stone, each step dragging against the weight of the silence that had settled around me. The dragging sound grew louder, closer. It was coming from behind me. I knew that if I looked back, I would see something I wouldn't be able to forget. But I couldn't stop now. Not while I was this far in. Not while I had already seen the papers with Dr. Roth's name on them. Whatever was happening here, whatever had happened here, I had to understand it. I had to find out what this place had hidden for all these years. The hallway stretched endlessly before me, the light flickering overhead casting long, distorted shadows on the cracked floor. The air had grown heavier, colder, making my skin prickle. It was hard to breathe, the air thick with dust and something else. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the smell had changed. It wasn't just decay anymore. It was almost metallic. Like the air had absorbed the blood, the fear of whatever had happened in this place. I moved faster now, trying to get to the exit. The hospital wasn't a maze. I had come in through the main door and taken the first right. It should be simple. Yet, the building seemed to be shifting around me, twisting the layout in subtle ways. Hallways that should have intersected were now dead ends. Rooms that should have been empty were filled with things I couldn't explain. Every turn felt like a step deeper into a labyrinth with no way out. The dragging sound continued. Closer. My heart pounded in my chest, and I began to break into a run. My footsteps echoed in the empty hallways, but they didn't feel like my own. They felt wrong. Like they were being mirrored, distorted. A mocking version of my own desperate flight. I rounded another corner, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The cold air burned my lungs, and the shadows seemed to grow longer with each step. The hospital was alive. It was watching. I could feel its presence everywhere, pressing in from all sides, suffocating me. Then I heard the whisper again. "You can't leave." The voice was clearer now. It was almost a command. The words reverberated through my skull, like they were being spoken inside my own mind. I stopped dead in my tracks, my body frozen, heart racing. I hadn't imagined it. I wasn't alone. I turned slowly, my hands trembling at my sides, and there, at the end of the hallway, I saw it. A figure. Tall, thin, wrapped in shadows. I couldn't make out its features, but I could see its outline, just enough to know that it was watching me. The air around it shimmered, distorted, like the very fabric of reality was bending and warping where it stood. I wanted to scream, to run, but my voice was trapped in my throat. The creature, if it could be called that, moved toward me, its steps slow, deliberate. Every movement it made seemed to shift the space around it, warping the air. It was like nothing I had ever seen, nothing that could exist in this world. My mind raced, scrambling for an explanation, for anything that could make sense of what I was seeing. But there was nothing. Only the oppressive silence of the hospital and the low, dragging sound that had now stopped altogether. It was standing in front of me now, its presence suffocating, its shape distorting further as it got closer. Its form was no longer fully human, not entirely. Parts of it flickered, like a glitch in a film reel, as if the very nature of its existence was unstable. It reached out toward me with long, thin hands, its fingers twitching in the air like they were beckoning me closer. "You shouldn't have come here." The voice was no longer a whisper. It was louder now, filling my head, speaking directly to me. It was familiar, yet foreign at the same time, like it had been waiting for me. The hallway twisted around me, and I stumbled backward, trying to get away. I hit the wall, my breath coming in short, panic bursts. I couldn't look away from it. I couldn't move. "It's too late," the voice murmured again, the words dripping with something cold, something ancient. The creature's face flickered again, and for a split second, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A face. Dr. Roth's face. His eyes were wide and empty, like they had been sucked out from within, leaving only hollow sockets. His skin was stretched tight, his features warped beyond recognition. I could barely breathe as I stared at the flickering image. Was it a vision? A memory? Something from this place's past? I didn't know. Before I could process what I had seen, the creature moved. It was impossibly fast, reaching for me with outstretched arms. I screamed, finally finding my voice, but it was a weak, strangled sound, lost in the thick air of the hospital. I turned and ran, but it was too late. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly ahead, a dark void with no escape. The walls seemed to close in around me, the lights flickering out one by one until I was plunged into complete darkness. I felt something cold wrap around my ankle. The creature had caught me. It pulled me back, its grip like ice. I struggled, kicking, clawing at the air, but its hold was unyielding. My vision blurred as I was dragged through the hospital, the world spinning around me in a sickening whirl. The whispering voice grew louder, echoing in my ears. "You cannot leave." And then everything went black. I woke up to the sound of my own breathing, shallow and rapid, as if I had been running for hours. My body was heavy, aching in places I didn't even know existed, but I couldn't remember how I had gotten here. The air around me was cold and damp, the smell of mildew thick in my nostrils. I tried to move, but my arms were stiff, weighed down as though something was pressing against me. When my eyes fluttered open, I was met with darkness. Not the kind of darkness you experience when the lights go out, but a deep, oppressive blackness that seemed to swallow everything around me. My heart pounded in my chest, the rhythmic thumping filling my ears as I tried to make sense of where I was. I shifted slightly, feeling the cold, uneven surface beneath me. I couldn't remember lying down. Wasn't I just running? Wasn't I just being dragged through the hospital? I tried to push myself up, but the weight on me, whatever it was, held me down. My hands shot out instinctively, brushing against something smooth and cold. Concrete? Metal? I couldn't tell. But then, a faint, distant sound caught my attention. A door creaked open somewhere far off. It was slow, deliberate, like it was testing the air. My breath caught in my throat. I wasn't alone. A sudden chill washed over me, the kind that comes with the sensation of being watched. I held my breath, straining to hear anything more, anything that might give me a clue as to what was going on. I felt something shift in the darkness, a movement just beyond my reach. It was faint, but unmistakable. A whisper, too soft to understand, yet chilling in its presence. I held still, the hairs on the back of my neck rising. There was something here. Something, or someone, watching me. A faint glow appeared in the distance, growing brighter as it edged closer. The light was uneven, casting long shadows that seemed to twitch and shudder with every step. I could barely make out a figure moving toward me, its form fluid, shifting as it moved through the haze of darkness. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But my body wouldn't obey. I could only watch as the figure grew closer, the details sharpening in the low light. It was humanoid, but its proportions were off, exaggerated. Its head was too large, the neck too thin, and its eyes, those dark, hollow eyes, seemed to be looking straight at me, piercing through the thick blackness like they could see right into my soul. It stopped a few feet away, its presence overwhelming. The air around me felt heavier, almost suffocating. I tried to move, but my body was paralyzed, as though I had been trapped in some kind of invisible web. My muscles screamed in protest, but I couldn't break free. "You're not meant to be here," the voice came again, clearer this time, but still warped, as though it were coming from deep within my skull. "You don't belong." I tried to speak, to ask it, whatever it was, what it wanted, but my mouth felt dry, my throat tight. The words wouldn't come. Instead, I could only watch as the creature reached out, its hand elongated and unnatural, fingers stretching far too long, its nails jagged like shards of broken glass. It hovered inches from my face, and I could feel the coldness emanating from it, the icy chill that seemed to seep into my very bones. "Leave this place, and never come back," it whispered. The words weren't a request. They were a command, one that made every part of me scream to comply. But something inside me, something deep and buried, refused to listen. I couldn't leave, not without answers. Not without understanding what was happening here, what had happened to me, to this hospital. "I won't leave until I know what this is," I whispered, my voice barely audible in the oppressive silence. The creature didn't respond immediately. It only stared at me, its hollow eyes unblinking, almost pitying. For a moment, I thought it might let me go. But then, it tilted its head to the side, its elongated neck cracking with an unnatural sound, like bones grinding against each other. "You have already seen too much." I could feel its words vibrating in my chest, as if the very air around me was pulsing with them. The darkness seemed to contract with each word, the shadows gathering, closing in from all sides. The walls of the room, if it could even be called a room, seemed to bend and warp, their outlines becoming indistinct, like the space itself was unraveling. I tried to force myself to move again, to escape, but I couldn't. The creature reached toward me once more, its fingers extending, impossibly long, its touch icy cold. I could feel the chill of its touch before I even made contact. "You are already part of this place," it murmured, its voice a hiss, its breath smelling faintly of rot. Before I could react, its hand brushed my cheek, the cold seeping through my skin. A vision exploded in my mind, violent and disorienting. Images flashed before my eyes, drifting, like ghosts, moments I couldn't quite grasp. A flash of light, an explosion of sound, and then, the hospital, burning. Dr. Roth, his body twisted, caught in the flames. Blood pooling on the floor. And then, an image that stopped my heart, a figure, standing at the center of it all, its face hidden in shadow, its hand outstretched, as if controlling everything around it. The vision ended as abruptly as it had begun, leaving me gasping for breath, my body trembling. "You don't understand," the creature hissed, its voice low and menacing. "But you will." With a sudden, jerking motion, it withdrew its hand, and the pressure around me seemed to lift, just enough for me to gasp in a breath of air. The darkness was still there, heavy and suffocating, but it wasn't quite as close as before. Before I could react, the figure turned, moving away, its form flickering and distorting as it faded into the dark. "You cannot escape," the voice echoed one last time, fading with the figure. "Not until it's done." I shifted slightly, feeling the cold, uneven surface beneath me. I couldn't remember lying down. Wasn't I just running? Wasn't I just being dragged through the hospital? I tried to push myself up, but the weight on me, whatever it was, held me down. My hands shot out instinctively, brushing against something smooth and cold. Concrete? Metal? I couldn't tell. But then, a faint, distant sound caught my attention. A door creaked open somewhere far off. It was slow, deliberate, like it was testing the air. My breath caught in my throat. I wasn't alone. A sudden chill washed over me, the kind that comes with the sensation of being watched. I held my breath, straining to hear anything more, anything that might give me a clue as to what was going on. I felt something shift in the darkness, a movement just beyond my reach. It was faint, but unmistakable. A whisper, too soft to understand, yet chilling in its presence. I held still, the hairs on the back of my neck rising. There was something here. Something, or someone, watching me. A faint glow appeared in the distance, growing brighter as it edged closer. The light was uneven, casting long shadows that seemed to twitch and shudder with every step. I could barely make out a figure moving toward me, its form fluid, shifting as it moved through the haze of darkness. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But my body wouldn't obey. I could only watch as the figure grew closer, the details sharpening in the low light. It was humanoid, but its proportions were off, exaggerated. Its head was too large, the neck too thin, and its eyes, those dark, hollow eyes, seemed to be looking straight at me, piercing through the thick blackness like they could see right into my soul. It stopped a few feet away, its presence overwhelming. The air around me felt heavier, almost suffocating. I tried to move, but my body was paralyzed, as though I had been trapped in some kind of invisible web. My muscles screamed in protest, but I couldn't break free. "You're not meant to be here," The voice came again, clearer this time, but still warped, as though it were coming from deep within my skull. You don't belong. I tried to speak, to ask it, whatever it was, what it wanted, but my mouth felt dry, my throat tight. The words wouldn't come. Instead, I could only watch as the creature reached out, its hand elongated and unnatural, fingers stretching far too long, its nails jagged like shards of broken glass. It hovered inches from my face, and I could feel the coldness emanating from it, the icy chill that seemed to seep into my very bones. Leave this place, and never come back, it whispered. The words weren't a request. They were a command, one that made every part of me scream to comply. But something inside me, something deep and buried, refused to listen. I couldn't leave, not without answers. Not without understanding what was happening here, what had happened to me, to this hospital. I won't leave until I know what this is, I whispered, my voice barely audible in the oppressive silence. The creature didn't respond immediately. It only stared at me, its hollow eyes unblinking, almost pitying. For a moment, I thought it might let me go. But then, it tilted its head to the side, its elongated neck cracking with an unnatural sound, like bones grinding against each other. You have already seen too much. I could feel its words vibrating in my chest, as if the very air around me was pulsing with them. The darkness seemed to contract with each word, the shadows gathering, closing in from all sides. The walls of the room, if it could even be called a room, seemed to bend and warp, their outlines becoming indistinct, like the space itself was unraveling. I tried to force myself to move again, to escape, but I couldn't. The creature reached toward me once more, its fingers extending, impossibly long, its touch icy cold. I could feel the chill of its touch before I even made contact. You are already part of this place, it murmured, its voice a hiss, its breath smelling faintly of rot. Before I could react, its hand brushed my cheek, the cold seeping through my skin. A vision exploded in my mind, violent and disorienting. Images flashed before my eyes, drifting, like ghosts, moments I couldn't quite grasp. A flash of light, an explosion of sound, and then, the hospital, burning. Dr. Roth, his body twisted, caught in the flames. Blood pooling on the floor. And then, an image that stopped my heart, a figure, standing at the center of it all, its face hidden in shadow, its hand outstretched, as if controlling everything around it. The vision ended as abruptly as it had begun, leaving me gasping for breath, my body trembling. You don't understand, the creature hissed, its voice low and menacing. But you will. With a sudden, jerking motion, it withdrew its hand, and the pressure around me seemed to lift, just enough for me to gasp in a breath of air. The darkness was still there, heavy and suffocating, but it wasn't quite as close as before. Before I could react, the figure turned, moving away, its form flickering and distorting as it faded into the dark. You cannot escape, the voice echoed one last time, fading with the figure. Not until it's done. I was left alone again, the silence pressing in from all sides. I lay there, trembling, unsure of what had just happened, unsure of what was real and what was a nightmare. But one thing was certain, whatever this place was, whatever it had become, I was part of it now. And there was no way out. I don't know how long I lay there, frozen in the suffocating darkness. My body refused to move, as if the air itself had thickened into something heavy, something unnatural. My mind was a storm of images, flashes of fire, blood pooling on the white tiles, a figure standing in the chaos. And that voice, that whisper that still echoed in my head. You cannot escape. Not until it's done. A shudder ran through me. What did it mean? What was it? I forced myself to sit up. The floor beneath me was rough and uneven, strewn with debris. My fingers brushed against something cold and brittle. A bone. I jerked my hand away. The dim light that had revealed the creature was gone now. I was alone. But even in the darkness, I could feel it. This place was not empty. There was something in the air, a presence just beyond the veil of sight. Watching. Waiting. I needed to move. Pushing against the dizziness that threatened to pull me back down, I got to my feet. My legs trembled beneath me, but I steadied myself against the damp wall. The air smelled of rot and mildew, thick with the scent of something long forgotten. Ahead, a faint glow pulsed through the darkness. A flickering, sickly greenish light. My heartbeat quickened. I had seen that light before. Dr. Roth's office. I didn't remember how I knew that, but the certainty settled deep in my bones. If there were answers, they were there. I took a cautious step forward. The sound of my own breath filled my ears, too loud in the unnatural silence. Every step sent echoes skittering down the unseen corridors, like whispers chasing me from the shadows. The hallway stretched impossibly long before me, the dim greenish light flickering at the far end. The walls seemed to shift, the tiles beneath my feet colder with every step. I passed open doors, their rooms swallowed by darkness. I didn't dare look inside. Then I heard it. A wet, dragging sound. Somewhere behind me. I stopped. The noise stopped too. My pulse pounded. I took another step. Drag. Thump. Drag. Closer now. I turned my head, but the darkness behind me was thick and unmoving. I could see nothing, but the sound was there, deliberate. Heavy. Something was following me. I swallowed hard and forced my feet to move faster. The light ahead grew stronger, casting warped shadows against the walls. The air thickened, pressing down on me. My skin prickled with the sensation of unseen eyes. I reached the door at the end of the hallway. It was slightly ajar. A deep breath. I pushed it open. The room inside was small, lined with metal filing cabinets and overturned chairs. Papers were scattered across the floor, covered in something dark, something that had dried long ago. The desk in the center was split down the middle, as though something massive had crashed through it. And there, on the far wall, was a single, ancient-looking monitor. Flickering. Still on. The greenish light came from its screen, illuminating the room with a sickly glow. Lines of text scrolled across the monitor, repeating over and over. You were never supposed to wake up. A cold sweat broke across my skin. The dragging sound was at the door now. I turned. The hallway was empty. But the door, it was closing. By itself. Slowly. Silently. A sliver of darkness remained, and then it clicked shut. The lock slid into place. And then the whisper came. Right behind me. It's already inside. The monitor flickered once. And then the light went out. Darkness swallowed me whole. The darkness was absolute. A void. A suffocating emptiness that pressed against my skin like cold hands. I stood frozen in the center of the room, barely breathing. My pulse pounded in my ears, too loud, too fast. I reached out blindly, fingers trembling as they grazed the surface of the desk. The wood was splintered, uneven beneath my touch. I wasn't alone. The whisper had been real. Something was in here with me. A faint rustling sound came from the far corner. My stomach twisted. I turned my head slowly, but there was nothing to see, just blackness stretching in every direction. Then, a breath. Not mine. Close. Too close. A sharp, shuddering exhale, like air forced through broken lungs. I felt it on my skin. I moved before I could think, stumbling backward, hitting the desk hard. The old wood groaned under my weight, but I barely noticed. My hands scrambled over the surface, searching for something, anything, I could use. Then the monitor flickered back to life. A weak, sputtering glow. Just enough light to see. Just enough light to know I wasn't alone. In the reflection of the screen, I saw it. A figure. Tall. Motionless. Standing directly behind me. My breath caught in my throat. Its shape was wrong, distorted, like something stretched too thin, its limbs just a little too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. No eyes. No face. Just a black void where features should have been. And yet, I knew it was watching me. The monitor flickered again. The words on the screen changed. Turn around. No. I couldn't. I wouldn't. My hands clenched into fists, nails digging into my palms. My body screamed at me to move, to run, to do anything but obey. But then, a sound. Wet. Crackling. It was laughing. Low. Broken. Like something trying to remember how. The screen flickered once more. You can't run. The laughter grew louder. The shadows around me thickened, stretching toward me, reaching. I slammed my fist against the monitor. The screen shattered, plunging the room back into darkness. Silence. For a moment, nothing. Then, a whisper. You broke the rules. Pain. White hot and sudden, exploding through my skull. I gasped. The floor vanished beneath me. And I was falling. Down, down, down. Into the dark. I woke up to silence. The kind of silence that isn't empty but full, thick, pressing, unnatural. My apartment was never this quiet. The city outside should have been humming with life, cars, distant sirens, the murmur of people below. But there was nothing. And then, whispering, right behind me. A breath against my ear, just enough to make my skin crawl. My name stretched and elongated, like someone savoring the sound. I spun around. Nothing. Just my dimly lit bedroom, the glow of the street lamp cutting through the blinds, casting bars of light across the floor. My breath came in short bursts, heart hammering in my chest. You're imagining things, I muttered, running a hand through my hair. Maybe I was overtired. Work had been relentless. Deadlines. Emails. An endless stream of tasks that blurred together. I lay back down, forcing my eyes shut. A creak. The floor. Right behind me. I held my breath. No. No, it had to be the building settling. Old apartments made noises, pipes, wood, the usual things. Then, closer this time, softer. Listen. I bolted upright. The voice was real. But I was alone. Wasn't I? I didn't move. I couldn't. My body was locked in place, every muscle frozen as if the whisper had reached inside me and taken hold. The air in the room felt different now, thicker, heavier. My breath was shallow, my ears straining against the silence, waiting for another sound. Nothing. I turned my head slowly, scanning the dim space around me. My bed. The dresser. The slightly open closet door. The sliver of darkness beyond it. The shadows pooling in the corners of the room, stretching unnaturally long as if reaching for me. A gust of wind rattled the blinds. My throat was dry. I had to get a grip. Swallowing hard, I forced myself to move, slipping out from under the covers. My bare feet touched the cold floor, sending a shiver up my spine. Each step toward the light switch felt deliberate, too slow. The switch was only a few feet away, but the room felt larger now, the darkness stretching between me and the glow of the hallway beyond. Click. The light flickered on. The room was empty. Of course, it was. But my skin still crawled. I glanced over my shoulder. I wasn't sure what I expected to see, something standing there? A shadow retreating just out of view? But there was nothing. Just the silence pressing on me, so suffocating it almost had weight. I exhaled a laugh, shaky, uncertain. Lack of sleep, I whispered to myself. That's all. But even as I said it, something felt wrong. I glanced at the closet. The door was open wider than before. I was sure of it. A cold prickle ran down my spine. My heartbeat pounded in my ears as I stepped closer, each breath coming shallower. The darkness inside the closet looked thicker than it should have been, as if the light from my room refused to reach inside. Just close it. My fingers trembled as I reached for the handle. A breath, soft, barely audible, escaped from the dark. I slammed the door shut. For a long moment, I just stood there, my palm pressed against the wood, my entire body rigid. I needed to leave this room. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand, clutching it tightly as I stepped back toward the door. I didn't even bother turning off the light before stepping into the hallway. As soon as I crossed the threshold, a whisper brushed against my ear, so close I felt the breath on my skin. You shouldn't have done that. I turned, and the lights flickered out. Darkness swallowed everything. The hallway, my room, gone. The dim light from the street lamps outside barely seeped through the windows. My breath hitched as I stood frozen in place, my phone gripped so tightly in my hand that my fingers ached. The air felt wrong. Heavy. Like something else was in a space with me. I fumbled to turn on my phone's flashlight. My hands were slick with sweat, shaking. The screen lit up, casting a weak glow over the hallway. The familiar walls, the framed pictures, the wooden floor, it was all still there. But something felt off. I forced myself to take a step forward. The floor creaked beneath my weight, too loud in the suffocating silence. I swallowed hard. The apartment wasn't big, just a bedroom, a bathroom, and the small living room and kitchen. Yet, right now, it felt like an endless void, stretching into something unfamiliar. Another step. The whisper came again. Right behind me. This time, I felt the breath on the back of my neck. I spun around, phone light shaking as I scanned the hallway. Empty. The door to my bedroom stood slightly ajar, just as I left it. The closed closet door. The stillness of the room beyond. I wasn't alone. I could feel it. I forced my legs to move, quickening my steps toward the kitchen. The dim light from the microwave clock glowed green, 2:30 a.m. My throat was dry. Maybe I needed water, something to ground me, something to make this feel normal again. I reached for a glass in the cupboard, but as I turned to the sink, I saw it. The reflection. Not mine. Something else. The window above the sink showed the faint outline of my living room behind me. My couch. My coffee table. The hallway leading to my bedroom. And a figure. Standing just at the edge of the darkness. Still. Watching. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. The whisper slithered through the air, closer this time. You shouldn't be here. My breath hitched. The reflection didn't move, but I saw it more clearly now. Not a shadow, not a trick of the light, someone was there. Their shape was wrong, stretched, blurred at the edges like they didn't fully belong in this world. I gripped the edge of the counter to keep myself upright. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. I squeezed my eyes shut. Counted to 3. 1, 2, 3. I opened them. The figure was gone, but the whisper remained. Closer. Right behind me. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. My body refused to move, every instinct screaming that if I turned to face whatever was behind me, I would see something I wasn't meant to see. The whisper lingered in the air, curling around me like fingers pressing against my skin. The apartment, so familiar only hours ago, now felt like an unfamiliar space, a hollow shell, warped into something wrong. My breaths came shallow. My grip tightened on the counter. The reflection in the window was just glass now, just the kitchen, the dim light from the microwave clock casting faint shadows. But I knew better. Something was here. I forced my fingers to move, reaching for the nearest drawer. It slid open with a quiet scrape, and my hand closed around the cold handle of a kitchen knife. Not that I believed it would do anything against whatever this was. A sound. Soft. Barely audible. A single step behind me. Then another. The floor groaned under a weight that wasn't mine. I swallowed back a cry, my entire body locked in place. My mind fought against the impossibility of it. Maybe I was dreaming. Maybe I was still in bed, tangled in sheets, my subconscious twisting my thoughts into this nightmare. But then, a breath, right against my ear. I lunged forward, spinning around, the knife raised in shaking hands. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would burst from my chest. But there was nothing. Only the empty kitchen, the hallway stretching into darkness. The living room was still, silent. No figure. No shadow. Just the overwhelming weight of the silence pressing down on me. I stumbled back, pressing myself against the counter. My breaths were ragged, my skin clammy. I forced myself to scan the room again, my phone's flashlight trembling in my grip. The beam of light cut across the furniture, the floor, the hallway leading back to my bedroom. Then, the closet door was open. I knew I had shut it. I knew. The door now stood ajar, revealing only a sliver of blackness inside. Too dark. The kind of darkness that swallowed light whole. A whisper drifted from within. Not words this time. Just the sound of breathing. Slow. Shallow. Waiting. I stepped back. My shaking fingers fumbled over my phone, pulling up the keypad. I had to call someone. Anyone. A friend, the police, I didn't care. The screen flickered. Then, a single notification appeared. New voicemail. My blood ran cold. The whisper came again, softer this time. Listen. My fingers hovered over the screen, hesitant, trembling. New voicemail. I didn't want to listen. Everything in me screamed to throw the phone across the room, to run, to leave this place and never look back. But my body refused to obey. My thumb moved on its own, pressing the notification. The screen dimmed. A soft click. And then, breathing. Shallow. Uneven. Not mine. It filled my ears, so close, so real, as if someone was on the other end of the line, pressing their lips against the speaker. Each inhale dragged out too long. Each exhale carried something else, something wet, something like a whisper trying to break through. A voice. Faint. Distorted. I strained to make out the words. The static crackled. A hush of movement. Then, you shouldn't have looked. The voicemail ended. A sharp ringing filled my ears, my pulse slamming against my skull. My breath hitched, my grip on the knife tightening. The apartment was silent again, but it wasn't empty. I knew it wasn't. The closet door was open. Wider now. The darkness inside yawned, stretching beyond the reach of my flashlight, as if the space inside wasn't part of my apartment anymore. As if it led somewhere else. Something shifted in the blackness. A shape. A shadow. Watching. I stepped back, my legs weak, unsteady. I needed to leave. Now. But the moment I turned toward the front door, the whisper returned, louder, more insistent. Don't go. I froze. The words didn't come from the closet this time. They came from right behind me. I spun, knife raised. Nothing. Nothing. Except the hallway mirror. And in it, I saw myself. And behind me, a figure. Close. Too close. Not just a shadow this time. I saw its face. And it was smiling. I couldn't move. My reflection stared back at me, but it wasn't alone. The figure stood just behind me, too close, its face stretching into something that mimicked a smile, but it was wrong. Too wide. Too many teeth. Its skin was pale, almost gray, and its eyes, empty. Black pits that swallowed everything. I wanted to scream. The knife in my hand felt useless, a toy against something that didn't belong in this world. My breath came in ragged gasps, my pulse hammering so hard it drowned out every other sound. Then, it moved. Not like a person. Its head twitched to the side in quick, unnatural jerks, as if it was testing the limits of its body. The smile never faded. I stepped back. The floor was ice beneath my feet. My body screamed at me to run, but I was trapped in its gaze, frozen in place by something deeper than fear. The lights flickered. For half a second, darkness swallowed the apartment. And when the light returned, the figure was no longer behind me. It was in the mirror. Only in the mirror. Watching. Waiting. And then it spoke. But its lips didn't move. The whisper came from the depths of the glass, curling into my ears, wrapping around my thoughts like a hand gripping my skull. You invited me in. My stomach dropped. I stumbled back, shaking my head, my throat too tight to force out words. My mind raced. When? How? The voicemail. I had listened. I had done exactly what it wanted. I turned away from the mirror, chest heaving. I had to get out. Now. The moment my foot crossed the threshold of the hallway, a deafening crack split the air. Glass. Shattering. I whipped around. The mirror had exploded outward, shards raining onto the floor. But the reflection was still there. A perfect copy of my apartment inside the broken frame, untouched. But something was wrong. The lights in the reflection were dimmer. The walls stained, covered in something dark. And the hallway inside the mirror stretched further than it should have, extending into endless black. Then I saw it. A hand, clawing its way out of the broken shards. Pale fingers, too long, nails cracked and jagged. I couldn't breathe. It was coming through. And this time, there was nothing between us. I don't remember the first time it happened. Maybe it was a trick of the light. Maybe I was too tired to notice at first. But at some point, I started realizing that my reflection, my own damn reflection, wasn't always right. It wasn't like in horror movies where something obvious jumps out at you. No, this was subtle, creeping. The kind of thing that makes you doubt yourself, makes you hesitate before looking again. At first, it was little things. I'd brush my teeth at night, and as I turned away, I thought I saw my reflection still watching me. Just a fraction of a second too long. Or when I adjusted my hair in the morning and something felt off. The way my reflection moved was just a little too smooth, or my eyes lingered on themselves longer than I meant them to. I ignored it. What else could I do? I chalked it up to exhaustion, stress. Work had been hell lately, and I wasn't sleeping well. Shadows clung to my apartment, stretching longer than they should, but I blamed the dim lighting. But then it got worse. It was 2 nights ago when I saw it. I had just finished washing my face. Water dripped from my chin as I reached for a towel, and in that split second, my reflection didn't move. My hand stopped midair. My reflection still had water on its face. I stood frozen, my heart thudding in my chest. Slowly, I moved my arm, testing it. This time, it followed. Perfectly. Naturally. Maybe I had imagined it? I exhaled, laughing nervously at myself. Losing it, huh? I muttered. But the reflection didn't smile. I backed away from the mirror. It was late. My mind was playing tricks on me. That had to be it. But as I flicked off the bathroom light and climbed into bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. And in the dark, I could almost swear I heard a breath, just barely louder than my own. Sleep didn't come easy that night. I lay on my back, staring at the ceiling, listening. The room was silent, too silent. No cars outside, no creaking of the old pipes in the walls. Just the faint sound of my own breathing. But there was something else beneath it. A whisper of sound, like an echo of my breath, slightly out of sync. I turned onto my side, pulling the blanket up to my chin. I was being paranoid. Overworked. Overtired. That was all. But when I finally drifted off, my dreams were filled with mirrors. Endless reflections stretching out in every direction, copies of me staring back. But not quite me. Their faces flickered, changing when I wasn't looking directly at them. Their smiles were just a little too wide. Their eyes just a little too dark. And then, one of them stepped forward. I woke up drenched in sweat. The air in my room felt heavy, pressing down on my chest like a weight. My throat was dry, my pulse hammering in my ears. I sat up, rubbing my face. "Get a grip," I whispered to myself. But as I turned my head toward the dark bathroom doorway, I saw it. The mirror. I had left the door open just a crack, enough for the dim glow of the streetlights to reflect off the glass. And standing there, in the shadows, was my reflection. Watching me. I froze. I didn't move. Didn't breathe. It was just my mind playing tricks on me. It had to be. I forced myself to move, slowly sliding my legs out of bed. The floor was cold beneath my feet. Step by step, I approached the bathroom, heart pounding. As I reached the door, I gripped the handle, steeling myself. One quick check. That's all. Proof to myself there was nothing there. I pushed the door open. The mirror stood still, reflecting the empty room back at me. Just me. Just the dark. I let out a shaky breath, forcing a chuckle. Losing it, I muttered again, shaking my head. But as I turned away, just for a second, I saw it. My reflection didn't move. I snapped my head back so fast my neck ached. But now, it was normal again, copying me perfectly. I backed out of the room, closing the door. I didn't look at the mirror again. I didn't want to. That night, I slept with the bathroom light on. But I still felt watched. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The sunlight pouring through the window didn't feel warm. It felt cold, as though it was just illuminating a stage, and I was the only one in the audience. I tried to go about my day like usual, coffee, shower, work. But everything felt distant. I couldn't quite focus. My hands seemed to move on their own, like they were following instructions from a place I couldn't reach. Every time I glanced at my reflection, I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. It wasn't just that the mirror felt off. It was like the world around me was starting to slip. The feeling intensified later that afternoon. I was standing in front of my living room window, staring out at the street below. I couldn't remember what I was looking for, just staring, lost in my thoughts. And then, a voice. It wasn't a whisper. It wasn't a murmur. It was clear and sharp. "Look at yourself." I spun around, heart leaping into my throat. The room was still. Empty. The voice was gone. I didn't know what to think. Who could have said that? There was no one in the apartment. The walls pressed in around me, and for a second, I felt like I was choking. The reflection. I didn't want to look. But my eyes were drawn to the mirror again, my body moving on its own. And there it was. It wasn't a full reflection. It was twisted. My body stood in the glass, but the face, my face, was contorted in a grotesque grin, the eyes wide, too wide, as if they were stretching beyond the limit of human expression. The smile was wrong, so wrong. It was a smile that didn't belong to me. I backed away. I stumbled over a chair, but I didn't take my eyes off the mirror. The reflection didn't move. It stayed there, that terrible grin plastered on my face. I turned and ran out of the room, slamming the door behind me. My heart was hammering in my chest, and I couldn't breathe. I grabbed my phone, hands shaking. But there was nothing, no one I could call. I was alone. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. I tried to focus on anything else, TV, books, anything to keep my mind occupied. But all I could think about was the face in the mirror. It haunted me like a shadow that wouldn't let go. At night, I found myself standing in front of the mirror again. I hadn't meant to, but my body moved toward it, like it was drawn there. I couldn't look away this time. My reflection stared back at me. My face. My body. But there was something wrong. Something that I couldn't quite place. And then it happened again. The reflection blinked first. It wasn't me. My heart stopped. The eyes in the mirror, those eyes, narrowed, almost as if they were sizing me up. And I swear, it smiled. I turned and ran from the bathroom. My pulse raced in my ears, the sound pounding louder and louder until I couldn't hear anything else. I collapsed onto the couch, gasping for air. I'm losing my mind, I thought. This isn't real. But deep down, I knew it was. I could feel it. The reflection was waiting for something. And I had no idea what it wanted. The next few days were a blur. I couldn't focus on anything, work, conversations, even eating. My mind kept pulling me back to the mirror, back to that face, that thing that wasn't mine but was, at the same time, everything I feared. I hadn't looked in the mirror since the night it smiled at me. I avoided it at all costs. It was as if, by ignoring it, I could pretend that it didn't exist. But the closer I got to it, the stronger the pull became. It was late in the evening, just as the sun had dipped below the horizon, when I found myself standing before it again. My breath was shallow, my pulse racing as if my body knew something I refused to acknowledge. The reflection was waiting for me. It didn't move. It didn't change. But somehow, it was worse. It was like the air in the room thickened, pressing down on me. I could almost hear my reflection breathing, matching the rhythm of my own breath, as if we were two beings locked in a silent, invisible war. I tried to look away, but I couldn't. My eyes were glued to the glass, drawn into the depth of it. There was a whisper, faint at first, like a soft hum beneath the surface. You can't escape. The words chilled me to my core. I'm waiting. I took a step back, my chest tight. The voice didn't just come from the reflection, it came from inside my head. It was mine, and yet it wasn't. The same voice that spoke to me in the silence of my thoughts, only now it was twisted, warped. I couldn't breathe. The walls felt like they were closing in, the room shrinking around me. I turned away, desperate to leave, but it was too late. Look at me. The command rang through my head, and I couldn't stop myself. My feet moved, dragging me back toward the mirror. I hated it. I hated how it controlled me. But the worst part was, a part of me wanted to see. I needed to know what it was. When I finally stood before it again, the reflection was different. It wasn't just standing there. The figure in the mirror, my reflection, was moving now. Slowly, unnaturally slow, as if it was stretching its limbs after a long, stagnant sleep. But the eyes were fixed on me. It wasn't me. It was something else. The reflection took a step forward, matching my own movements. But this time, it didn't mirror me. It watched me. The grin was back, stretching wider than before, like it was savoring something it had been waiting for. "Why are you doing this?" I gasped. It didn't respond. But the eyes, they seemed to gleam with something dark, something ancient. Then it blinked, and I froze. My own reflection blinked in perfect time with me, but I felt it. There was something off about it. Like it wasn't waiting for me to do something. It was waiting for me to stop. Waiting for me to look away. I wasn't in control anymore. "It's not me. It's not me." The words spiraled in my mind, but they did nothing to calm the panic rising in my chest. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the carpet, and hit the wall with a thud. My heart was racing, beating in my throat. I could feel my reflection's eyes on me even as I looked away, my gaze snapping to the ground in desperation. For a moment, the room was silent. The mirror seemed to settle, the reflection staying still. But I could still feel it, its presence, like an invisible weight pressing on my chest. I turned toward the door, but before I could even move, I heard a sound. A soft shuffle, like feet dragging across the floor. It wasn't me. My reflection had moved again. I didn't need to look. I already knew. I felt it. It was right behind me. And then, as if it had been holding its breath this entire time, I heard it. "Look at me." The words were cold, commanding. They weren't my own thoughts anymore. They were the reflections. It knows me. It's inside me. I couldn't run. I couldn't scream. All I could do was turn. And when I did, I saw it, standing just behind me in the glass, its face inches from mine, its grin stretching even wider. I didn't scream. I couldn't. The reflection whispered one last thing before everything went black. "It's your turn now." I don't know how much time passed after the reflection spoke those words. I couldn't see anything. I couldn't hear anything. Everything was dark, like the world itself had ceased to exist. But then, a sound broke through. Faint at first, like a muffled thump, then another, louder this time. I felt it before I heard it. The sensation of being watched, of something pressing against me, waiting for me to move. I opened my eyes. The room was exactly the same. The walls, the ceiling, the door, the mirror, everything. Nothing had changed. Except for one thing. I wasn't alone anymore. There was someone, or something, standing in front of the mirror. It wasn't a reflection. It was real. I could feel the weight of it in the air, heavy and oppressive, like the atmosphere had turned thick, almost suffocating. I couldn't move. My body felt frozen, like it had been locked in place, bound by an invisible force. And then, the voice. "It's time." I didn't want to respond. I didn't want to acknowledge it, but I had no choice. The voice was inside my head, as though it had always been there, just waiting to break free. I forced myself to look at the mirror. There, standing just inches from the glass, was the figure that had once been my reflection. It wasn't smiling anymore. It was staring at me, those eyes, those terrible, dark eyes, locked onto mine with an intensity that made my skin crawl. The face was still mine, but it was wrong. The edges of it seemed to blur, like it was stretching beyond the bounds of what a face should be, becoming something other. The skin around its eyes was pulled tight, the smile still there, but now twisted into something far darker than I had ever seen. It opened its mouth, but it didn't speak with words. It didn't need to. The thoughts came sharp, invasive. You thought you could escape me. You thought you could avoid the truth. But you're mine now. I tried to move, tried to get away, but my body wouldn't respond. It was like I wasn't controlling it anymore. And then, in that moment, I understood. I understood what had been happening all this time. The reflection hadn't just been a mirror image. It had been alive. It had been watching me, waiting for the right moment to take over. To become me. The world began to spin, and I couldn't tell if I was the one moving or if everything around me was. The room started to distort, stretching and warping like the fabric of reality itself was tearing. The reflection moved closer to the glass. I could see its hands, pale and slender, pressing against the surface as if it was trying to push through. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. And then, the reflection smiled again. Only this time, it was me. The face I had once known was now twisted beyond recognition. Its lips curled into a wide grin, revealing teeth that weren't mine, sharp, jagged, unnatural. The eyes widened, bulging in a way that shouldn't have been possible, staring straight into my soul. "It's your turn now," it whispered again, but this time, the voice wasn't coming from the reflection. It was coming from me. I couldn't breathe. My chest was heavy, and the air felt thick with an oppressive force. It was like the reflection had taken control of my very being, and I had nothing left. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. And then, I smiled. I could feel my lips stretching, my teeth showing, the grin spreading wider and wider until it hurt. It wasn't my smile anymore. It was the reflection's. And I knew then that it had one. I wasn't just trapped in the mirror anymore. I had become it. And the reflection was me. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.